Jon Snow stood atop the wall in the graying dawn, the wind snapping at his cloak like a living thing. The chill was sharper this morning, laden with the sting of ice, even though the spring sun had begun its slow climb toward the zenith. He had spent countless hours on this parapet, scanning the horizon for threats he could neither see nor defy. A habit born of suspicion, of watching too many shadows move against him. The vast, unyielding expanse of wilderness spread out before him. Now it felt emptier than ever, as though it had been picked clean of hope. The pale blue sky over the horizon should have promised warmth, but it only reminded him that he felt no heat. In the distance, the world simply fell away. He clenched and unclenched his hands, remembering the duty that bound him to this ancient edifice. He was the Lord Commander. He reminded himself of that frequently, though the title had lost its meaning in the swirl of recent events. He had sought to unite old enemies, to bend tradition for the sake of survival, to end a war that had spanned millennia. But the weight of it, the unrelenting suspicion from his own brothers, and the memory of betrayal still smarted in his chest. The tension had not dissolved even after the greatest battles had been fought. Resentment lingered, like a frost that never thawed. He turned his head slightly to watch the men who manned the top of the wall. Some huddled in corners to share body heat, while others walked briskly along the walkway to keep their blood moving. He had learned the names of so many. He had held them through grief, championed them in the darkest hours, even seen them die in the snow. Yet at times he felt as though he stood apart from them, a specter, neither living nor dead. The wound in his chest from the daggers of men he trusted had mended physically, but in his heart, the scars only deepened. Melisandre's magic had brought him back, yet that second chance was not without its consequences. He understood something greater than duty now, something about the fragility of life, the final fleeting moment that awaited every one of them. He had felt an absolute darkness, an emptiness that still called to him in restless nights. That experience of crossing the threshold and returning had changed him in ways he could not describe to any mortal soul. Yet here he remained, bound by oaths that no longer made sense to him, overshadowed by ghosts, and tormented by the memory of what might have been, had he simply let himself die. It felt as though he had returned to a world that did not fit him anymore. His breath steamed in the cold air, and he exhaled slowly, letting that single wisp of warmth vanish into the freezing sky. The Watch was dwindling despite their recent alliances with the wildlings. Castle Black seemed emptier each day, more deserted. Some might claim that was good, that the realm was safer now, that fewer rangers were needed. But Jon sensed that it was not victory that emptied these corridors, but a subtle crumbling of tradition, a loss of purpose. They had withstood the ultimate threat from the far north, yet no one truly knew what to do afterward. He lingered a few moments more, letting the wind lash his face as though punishing himself for his indecision. Leaving the wall should have been unthinkable. Even after he'd been resurrected, he had tried to carry on with the life that had defined him for so many years. The vow was meant to be for life, yet his life had ended once already. He wondered if that vow still held, or if his time here had truly ended. With a dry twist of his mouth, he turned and strode down the stairwell. The corridors below the top of the wall were lit by torches, the flicker of flames dancing against damp stone. He recognized every notch, every weathered line, every station where men once stood guard, now left unmanned. His footsteps echoed in the gloom, his cloak trailing behind him. As he made his way toward his quarters, he could hear the distant chatter of newly arrived recruits. They were few, a ragged bunch with eyes that darted nervously. Men with battered hearts or criminals with no other refuge. He knew none of them well. So much had changed. Ghost trailed him silently. The great white direwolf padded with the lethal grace of a hunter, crimson eyes sliding over the darkness. Jon felt comfort in his companion's presence, a final link to the days in Winterfell. He remembered being a boy, forging a bond with a runt pup in the snow. Now, both were far from any semblance of what they once knew. He opened the door to his private chamber. It was sparse. A simple cot, a table with a flickering lamp, a chest for the meager possessions he had gathered. A single window slit looked out on the courtyard. He noticed someone had left a steaming bowl of stew on the table. Some courtesy from one of the stewards trying to show respect. The smell was hardly appetizing, but it tugged at his hunger nonetheless. He crossed the room, letting his cloak drop onto the cot, and stared at the stew without taking a bite. A dull ache pressed at his temples, and the old doubts coiled inside him like an ever-hungry serpent. Memories of Winterfell hovered, unbidden. The hall with roaring fires, the laughter of his siblings, half-siblings, he had believed at the time, and the sense that a bigger destiny waited beyond the frozen ramparts. He tried to quell those thoughts, for they only haunted him. Instead, he thought of the uncharted corners of the world, the stories Sam had told him of the ancient empire of Valyria, the old seat of Targaryen might. Jon recalled those hours spent with Sam, in the library's musty corners, poring over tomes and half-ruined scrolls that spoke of the doom of Valyria, once a peninsula brimming with magic, dragons, and wealth beyond comprehension. It was now a cursed land. Few dared even sail near it. The scattered pages that remained from the great library of the Citadel described Valyria's cataclysm with an air of dreadful mystery: storms of flame, seas of molten rock, entire armies of twisted monstrosities. Something had obliterated the greatest empire the world had ever known, leaving only ruins and legends in its wake. An idea formed in Jon's mind on those quiet nights, one that both terrified and fascinated him. A land of dragons had once existed, a land that gave birth to conquerors and legends. He knew his heritage now. He was a Targaryen in truth, and though he had resisted the notion, it had seeped into his identity. Daenerys had been the Dragon Queen, and though she had perished, her cause had changed him. Yet that wasn't all. Jon felt a longing to understand the roots of that ancient power. Something called to the hidden Targaryen blood in his veins, beckoning him to discover what remained of the old city. Perhaps in the ruins lay an answer to questions he could not articulate. Why had the gods allowed him a second life? What purpose, if any, remained for him? It was a fool's errand. He knew that much. Valyria was said to be haunted by demons, plagued by the curse of the doom, shrouded in toxic fumes and unnatural storms. Sailors told tales of creatures that stalked the broken columns and half-submerged halls, twisted things that should not exist. The water itself was said to be diseased. Ancient, broken towers jutted from the seas like bones of some colossal beast. No sensible man would choose to go there. And that was precisely why Jon was tempted. He no longer thought of himself as a man who had to fear death. He had walked that threshold once. He wanted answers about who he was, about what he might become, about the ancient secrets lost to time. If a father he never knew had sprung from that line, if Daenerys' attempt to forge a new world had ended in such pain, maybe the roots of that tragedy could be found in the ashes of Valyria. Or maybe he simply hungered for escape. If he remained here, among these deserted halls, he would watch the Night's Watch crumble. He would endure the stares and half-hidden accusations that he did not truly belong. He would gradually lose himself to bitterness. He reached out and touched the steaming bowl of stew, feeling the heat on his palm, but still he did not eat. Instead, he leaned back, closed his eyes, and felt the tug of that idea again. He had spent weeks pushing it away, telling himself to remain loyal, that the realm needed him. But the realm carried on. The realm had found new monarchs and new lines of succession in the south. The realm had little use for a bastard Lord Commander King who never was. Even his presence here was an oddity, a mismatch. And every day his soul drifted further into regret. Ghosts settled near his feet, pressing his body to Jon's legs. A gentle reminder that if the world turned its back on him, he still had one loyal companion. Jon absently stroked the direwolf's thick fur and opened his eyes once more. The lamplight flickered, casting his shadow on the far wall. The shape of him, tall and lean, with hair dark as coal, flickered as if it were another man entirely, someone waiting for him to make a choice. That night, as the hour grew late, he found himself in the library, searching. The shelves were half empty, the best books carried off to more welcoming keeps. But Sam had once organized everything as best he could. John's eyes slid over spines of leather-bound volumes, each scrawled with titles that flaked away under the slightest touch. He found a thin, battered treatise on the Valyrian freehold. Inside, he discovered a hint at safer passages through the smoking sea, rumored by some explorer centuries ago. It was no map, but it described a phenomenon in the currents near certain outcroppings of black volcanic stone. How the tides might shift, occasionally granting a brief safe lane. The text was incomplete, of course, but the possibility glimmered. He lost track of time in that dusty quiet, reading by the lantern's glow, turning pages that threatened to crumble in his hands. He read of the 14 Flames, the great ring of volcanoes that once shaped the peninsula's fortunes. He read of the Dragon Lords, pale-haired scions, with mastery over fire and scale. He read, too, of the madness that consumed them in their final days. Experiments in blood magic, forging of cursed steel, the forging of Valyrian steel itself. The authors described hidden vaults carved into the living rock, rumors of stasis or living fire that refused to die. A trembling excitement coursed through John. This place was not for the faint of heart. Yet as he closed the book, he realized a part of him had already decided. Over the following days, he became a silent figure at Castle Black, going through the motions of leadership, while keeping his true intention hidden. The Rangers reported minor disturbances, but nothing that demanded the entire order. A small band of wildlings had spotted remnants of undead stragglers, but they soon scattered. With the war ended, the days of constant vigilance seemed distant. Some believed that if the others had been defeated, the Watch could finally lower its guard. Others insisted that an even greater threat might arise one day. Yet none could say for sure. John watched them train in the yard, green boys flailing with dull swords, older veterans rolling their eyes. His presence elicited stiff salutes and forced courtesy. He delivered instructions with as much composure as he could muster. But the truth lingered like a phantom. He was already gone. His heart wasn't in these walls. The vow that had once defined him felt more like a chain. And so he began making his preparations, quietly, unobtrusively, gathering supplies that might sustain a voyage across the sea. He bartered, with coin he had hoarded or gifts he had from the generosity of the late Queen, for a ship that might carry him from Eastwatch by the sea, the Night's Watch port, to a safe harbor south, and then onward. He told no one of his plan, not even Tormund, who had become a strange sort of friend. He suspected Tormund might try to talk him out of it, or might demand come. John did not want to place anyone else in danger. This was his burden alone. In the dim pre-dawn of a frigid morning, John stood in the stables, brushing down a dark-coated mare. She nickered softly, her breath steaming in the chill. His fingers moved absently through her mane, calming her. Ghost lingered near the open doors, ears perked for any unusual sound. As John finished securing saddlebags, he took one last look around the stable. The scent of hay and dung brought him back to simpler days, but the memory offered no comfort now. He mounted the mare, guiding her outside into the yard. The sky was a tapestry of bruised colors, pale purples and sickly oranges creeping above the horizon. He skirted around the courtyard, avoiding the main gates where men might question why the Lord Commander was leaving so early. Instead, he led his horse down a side ramp that was often used for deliveries. He had chosen a time when the guards would be changing shifts, so the fewer eyes he met, the better. He wore a thick cloak and nondescript black leathers. Though that hardly disguised him from anyone who knew him, he hoped at least not to draw immediate attention. Ghost loped silently behind, a white specter in the half-light. The few men he encountered merely nodded, likely assuming he was off on some official business. No one questioned him. None had reason to. When he passed the last sentry, who gave him a curt inclination of the head, he urged his horse into a steady canter. He did not look back at Castle Black. Its silhouette would remain etched in his mind, the great fortification beneath the enormous wall. He wondered if he would ever see it again. The ache in his chest was real, but not enough to halt him. He kept riding. It took him the better part of 2 days to reach Eastwatch by the sea, riding hard and resting little. He slept under the open sky when night came, reliant on Ghost's vigilance to warn him of any approaching danger. His dreams were troubled, but elusive. Dark shapes dancing on the periphery of his vision, echoes of dragon wings overhead, and the hush of a voice he could not name. Each morning he woke with that same sense of resolve. He had departed for good reason, and turning back would only entangle him in more regret. When at last he caught sight of Eastwatch's wooden palisades and the stony docks beyond, the sea opened before him in a vast sweep of dull blue and gray. The tang of salt filled his lungs, a sharp contrast to the icy dryness of the far north. Winter was receding, but the cold currents here could still freeze a careless man. He approached at mid-morning, mindful that he might see men of the watch who could question why he traveled alone. But luck favored him. Those who saw him ride in simply assumed the Lord Commander was checking on the port garrison, or saw to duties that they would not question. The black cloak gave him enough authority to quell idle conversation. John led his mare to the stable near the docks, offering her to a stable boy with instructions to keep her fed and cared for. He left enough coin behind to forestall any suspicion. Then he made his way to the cluster of buildings that housed the port's small taverns and supply huts. He knew from letters and contacts that a single-masted cutter named the Sparrowhawk would be waiting for him. It belonged to a Bravosy smuggler who had no qualms about traveling to infamous places for the right price. Rumors claimed that this smuggler had once ferried contraband across the summer sea and up the Cuyane, escaping Liceni pirates by the skin of his teeth. That kind of bold, perhaps reckless, seamanship was precisely what John required. He found the vessel moored at the far end of the quay. Its sails were furled, the hull slender, built for speed rather than cargo. A single figure bent over the deck, fiddling with a coil of rope. He was a wiry man of medium height, hair graying at the temples, his movements calm and precise. When John stepped onto the gangplank, the man looked up with sharp, watchful eyes. "Captain Faratho?" John asked, voice low. The man nodded. "You have the look of a black brother," he said. "You're the one who wrote me." John offered a smaller purse of coin as a deposit, then said, "I am." He did not elaborate. He knew trust was tenuous in these dealings, and the captain cared more about payment than background. "You have my thanks." The smuggler weighed the purse in his hand, tested its heft, then tucked it beneath his coat. "You'll owe more once we sail," he said in a businesslike tone, "including hazard pay. The seas are restless, and your destination is less than welcoming." "I understand," John said. "We'll settle it in due time." The captain nodded curtly. "Be ready to leave in 2 hours. I have to gather a few last provisions. After that, the tide will be in our favor for a southward crossing." John took a moment to survey the deck and rigging. He knew little of seafaring, but the cutter looked well maintained. The mainmast was sturdy, the sails patched but serviceable. The cramped quarters below deck were minimal, but adequate for a small crew and a passenger or two. He thanked the captain again, then stepped off the boat to wait. He found a quiet spot near the wharf, sitting on a half-broken crate. Ghost curled beside him. Seabirds wheeled overhead, crying plaintively. The air smelled of fish and brine, tinged with rot from the day's catch that had been gutted and tossed aside. Dockworkers bustled past, carting crates, shouting instructions. Life here was a constant dance of comings and goings, of men who lived for trade and seldom asked questions. John lost himself in that bustle, recalling the first time he had left Winterfell for the Wall, remembering how uncertain he had been about everything except that he must go. Now, here he was again, consumed by the same sense of necessity. Duty had led him once, but now it was something else. A curiosity, or perhaps a desperation for answers. The 2 hours passed slowly, punctuated by the crash of waves on the rocks below. He heard men calling from the docks, cursing the cold, haggling over freight. Eventually, the smuggler's voice rang out from the deck of the Sparrowhawk, calling him to board. John gathered what little he carried, a knapsack with extra clothes, some provisions of hard bread, salted meat, a waterskin, and the old texts he had carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from salt spray. He had only Longclaw strapped at his hip, the weight of Valyrian steel giving him a measure of comfort. Ghost followed, leaping onto the deck with an easy bound. The few deckhands that Captain Ferratho employed stepped back, uneasy at the sight of the great white wolf. But they did not protest. Smugglers were accustomed to strange clients with stranger demands. John helped with the lines as best he could when the captain instructed him. The wind tugged at the sails, and the deck dipped beneath his feet as they eased out of the harbor. The gulls gave way to open sea. Eastwatch shrank behind them, the black fortress looming at the fringe of the world, until it was little more than a silhouette against the northern horizon. John stood at the stern for a long while, arms braced on the rail, watching the only home he had known for years recede. He wondered if anyone would realize he was gone, if Tormund would pound at the gates, roaring questions, or if Edith would whisper that he knew all along. Perhaps they'd guess he had gone searching for some lost cause. The thought brought a mix of guilt and relief. But as the gulls vanished, replaced by the restless hiss of the open sea, he let that guilt fade. His choice was made. The first days at sea were routine by the standards of men who knew the water well. John did what he could to aid the small crew, though they were suspicious of him. He coiled ropes, scrubbed the deck, kept watch from the bow, peering over the rolling waves. Ghost remained below deck at night, curling in a corner away from the crew's hammocks. Some nights, John stayed with him, lulled by the rocking of the ship, feeling the swirl of salted wind. He found it oddly calming, this slow drift on the currents, far from the petty grievances of men. Yet his mind remained fixed on Valyria and the uncertainties that lay ahead. He had told Captain Ferratho only that he wished to reach the coast beyond Volantis, near the waters rumored to lead into the smoking sea. The smuggler was no fool. He likely guessed where John intended to go. But as long as the coin was real, he asked no questions. Now and again, the captain warned him of horrors and monstrous storms. He spoke of men who came back from glimpses of Valyria with limbs charred or flesh rotted away. He told stories of entire fleets lost without a trace. John listened without comment. He had stared into the face of undead terror. He had walked beyond death. Perhaps the fabled curses of Valyria would be the end of him, or perhaps he would find something else. In either case, he did not waver. Day by day, the temperature grew milder, the air less harsh. Thick furs gave way to lighter garments. Clouds scudded overhead, sometimes unleashing downpours, sometimes clearing to reveal azure skies. The sun shone longer now, though the wind remained bracing. At night, John sometimes joined the captain at the helm. The star patterns were different here in the southern latitudes, and Ferratho would navigate by them. John would lean against the rail, occasionally glimpsing the faint glimmer of phosphorescent life in the waves. Ghost's reflective eyes would peer from the shadows. The monotony of the voyage lulled him, letting him think about the improbable path that had brought him here. He recalled the words of the Night's Watch oath. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. He had repeated them, believing them to be his destiny. But destiny had a cruel sense of humor. He had been a king in the north, if only briefly, and found out he was the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Blood of the dragon. He had known love, and he had killed that love with his own hand, out of a sense of duty. Such heavy contradictions weighed on him still. Perhaps in the quiet of ruined Valyria, he might finally lay them to rest. One dusk, the wind died, and the cutter drifted aimlessly on calm seas. An uneasy hush fell over the waters. The crew muttered about ill omens, but the captain merely watched the horizon. John stood by the bow, scanning the waves. The last rays of the sun stained the sky with red, casting long shadows across the deck. He ran a hand over Ghost's fur, feeling the direwolf tremble with tension. Whether it was the stillness that unsettled the beast, or some other sense that wolves possessed, John did not know. Darkness crept across the sea, turning it into a mirror for the fading crimson sky. Clouds slid in from the west, heavy with potential storms. The silence became profound, broken only by the groan of the ship's timbers. John felt a gathering pressure in the air, a certain dryness in the back of his throat. He had been raised in the north, but at times he felt more attuned to changes in the weather than men born on these shores. A restlessness stirred, as though the sea itself was holding its breath. The storm came suddenly with a shriek of wind. Sails snapped taut, lines threatened to break, and the Sparrowhawk listed dangerously. Captain Faratho roared for the men to take in the sails, and John rushed with them, straining to pull the thrashing canvas under control. Rain pelted them in horizontal sheets, stinging their skin. Lightning forked overhead, illuminating the chaotic swirl of clouds. In those flashes, John glimpsed the fear in the sailors' faces. Waves rose like rolling mountains, crashing against the hull. Ghost howled, trying to keep his footing on the slick deck. Minutes stretched into hours as the storm raged. John lost track of time. He was cold, soaked to the bone, gripping ropes with numb fingers to keep from being flung overboard. The thunder boomed, and each lightning strike etched ghostly patterns across his vision. The captain fought the wheel, teeth gritted, cursing every god he knew. At times, it felt as though the sea might swallow them whole. Yet somehow they persevered. Slowly, the storm's fury lessened, the wind shifting from gale to gust, the rain easing to a steady patter. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the sky, the Sparrowhawk had survived, though battered. The mainsail was torn. 2 of the crew had been injured, and fresh leaks dribbled seawater into the hold. Exhausted, John helped the crew as they attempted makeshift repairs. They pumped out water, patched the sail with spare canvas, and bound the injured men's wounds. Even Ghost seemed exhausted, curling up to sleep in a corner below deck once the danger passed. That day was spent limping along the waves, battered and slowed. John was in no hurry, though. He would not complain. If the storm had claimed them, the question of Valyria would have died on the sea. But they were alive, and as the day wore on, a faint breeze picked up once more, carrying them south. The captain shot John glances, perhaps wondering if his passengers' talk of cursed lands had invoked ill luck. But he kept any accusations silent. The next several days blurred into a routine of minor hardships. The weather never again reached the frenzy of that storm, but it remained fickle. Sometimes they made good speed, other times they drifted aimlessly, cursing the lack of wind. Food supplies were limited, and fresh water more so. John shared what rations he had brought, mindful that a hungry crew could turn mutinous. Ghost caught seabirds or rats on occasion, supplementing their meager meals. Each day the ship pressed on, guided by the smuggler's charts and the stray bits of knowledge gleaned from half-forgotten logs. John often found himself lost in thought, standing at the prow or leaning over the rails. The memories coursed through him like tides. He saw Ygritte's face, her fiery hair, and the way she looked at him in the caverns beyond the wall, telling him he knew nothing. He saw the watchful, trusting gaze of Samwell Tarley, who believed in him when others did not. He saw the towering presence of his direwolf, a piece of the Old North that remained steadfast, and he remembered Daenerys, her tragic determined path, and how it had fallen to him to end her life. Each recollection weighed like a stone around his heart. Sometimes he would close his eyes and see the swirl of bone-white branches under a starry sky, an image of the weirwood trees of the north. The old gods had once watched him from those red eyes in the bark. He wondered if they watched him still, or if he was too far away, if some cosmic design held his strings, or if he drifted unmoored. One evening, the captain approached him where he leaned against the rail, staring into the golden wash of sunset. "We'll be making landfall in a few days," he said. "Need to resupply. We'll dock in a small cove north of Volantis, well away from official eyes. After that," he trailed off, letting the words hang. "You still plan to go on?" John nodded. "I do. You know there's talk of pirates roving near the gullet, and that's nowhere near as dangerous as where you're headed." John just said, "I know," in a quiet tone. The captain studied him for a moment, eyes flicking to Longclaw. "You're not an ordinary traveler, are you?" "No," John admitted. "But I mean you no harm, and I appreciate what you're doing." He reached into his cloak and drew out the heavier pouch, which contained the remainder of what he owed. He handed it over. "Half now, half once we make the cove. Then we're square." "Mamnun." Faratho weighed the purse in his hand, face impassive. "We'll do our best to get you where you need to be," he said. "But I'm not sailing into the smoking sea. Past the Isle of Cedars is where I stop. Beyond that, the waters are cursed, My men would mutiny, or worse. I can offer you a skiff if you insist on going further. John accepted this without complaint. He never expected more. That will be enough. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent pinks and oranges. John watched the captain walk away, the deck creaking beneath his footsteps. Ghost was nearby, ears pricked to the wind. John placed a hand on the direwolf's head, the contact grounding him. He inhaled the salt air, steadying himself for what lay ahead. They reached the hidden cove at midday. A crescent beach ringed by sharp rocks, half obscured by dense jungle growth, offered a secluded landing. The water was calmer here, turquoise near the shallows, deepening to azure beyond. John had never seen anything like it in the north, this vibrant, living world of heat and color. The air was humid, filled with the scent of wet leaves and tropical flowers. Bird calls echoed from the lush canopy. The few huts on shore appeared abandoned, though the captain insisted it was a safe place to make repairs and gather fresh water. The moment they dropped anchor and lowered the boat, John helped row supplies ashore. The beach sand was hot beneath his boots, and Ghost loped along, sniffing at the strange vegetation. The men busied themselves checking the hull for damage from the storm, patching cracks with tar. The captain ordered half his crew to scout for streams of fresh water. John volunteered to assist, if only to stretch his legs after weeks on the cramped vessel. He ventured inland, forging a path through dense ferns and gnarled trees dripping with moss. Insects buzzed in swarms. It took effort not to flinch each time something crawled on his exposed skin. A lifetime on the wall did not prepare him for the teeming life here. Eventually, they heard the rush of a small waterfall. The water pooled in a natural basin surrounded by tall grasses. The men filled their casks, eager to bring fresh water back to the ship. John stood watch, hand on Longclaw, while Ghost circled the perimeter, sniffing for threats. He saw bright birds perched in the branches overhead, brilliantly colored as though painted. The jungle pressed in with a claustrophobic closeness, quite different from the wide-open spaces of the north. Yet it was fascinating in its own way. The heat made him sweat under his leather jerkin, and the dampness clung to his skin. They worked quickly, mindful that pirates or slavers could appear at any moment. Once the casks were full, they headed back, forging a path with cutlasses to clear dense undergrowth. John found himself grateful for Ghost's keen senses, which kept them from walking straight into a nest of large, venomous serpents that slithered in the brush. The men cursed the wildlife under their breath. Even so, they made it back without incident, emerging onto the beach to see the sparrowhawk bobbing calmly in the tide. Seabirds circled overhead, marking the fresh catch of fish the crew had hauled in. Everything seemed momentarily peaceful, though tension hummed in the background. They were trespassers in a land that hardly knew or cared about them. At nightfall, a small fire crackled on the sand. The men gathered around it, taking a rare moment of ease. They shared dried fish, roasted a few crabs they had caught in tide pools. The conversation was subdued. Eyes flicked warily at the darkness beyond the firelight. No one truly felt secure here, and they would leave at first light. John sat off to the side, content with silence. Ghost prowled at the edge of the jungle, eyes gleaming red in the flickering flame. When dawn arrived, they reboarded the Sparrowhawk and set sail once more. The sea felt calmer, the skies a clearer shade of blue, but an undercurrent of anticipation pervaded the crew. Each day brought them closer to the gateway of the smoking sea, an area that no mariner approached lightly. The wind propelled them south along the coastline, the lush lands of the disputed regions passing to their left, their beaches and hills receding behind the horizon. They avoided Volantis itself, not wanting to draw attention from the harbor masters or risk official entanglements. Instead, they skirted the coastline at a discreet distance, following the smugglers' well-trodden routes. Occasionally, sails would appear on the horizon, merchant galleys or fishing boats. The Sparrowhawk would adjust course to avoid them if needed. John saw the crew's tension, the hush that fell whenever a strange ship approached, but no one gave chase. He could sense the subtle skill of Captain Faratho at the helm, reading the winds and the sea's flow. 2 weeks after leaving Eastwatch by the Sea, they reached a point where the water changed. The color grew murkier, the waves somehow more turbulent, the sky overhead tinged with a faint haze. Captain Faratho called John to the helm, showing him how the wind patterns became erratic here, how the compass needle they possessed, an expensive Bravosi device, fluctuated in the presence of hidden currents. The men murmured of sulfur scents carried on the breeze, though John could not detect anything beyond the usual brine. Even so, an oppressive atmosphere settled over them, as though crossing an invisible threshold. Eventually, land reappeared on the eastern horizon. Twisted mountains or pillars of rock, battered by centuries of volcanic upheaval. Smoke clung to their peaks, drifting upward in ragged plumes. The sun was hidden behind layers of cloud, and the temperature spiked, thickening the air with humidity and something else. Perhaps the volcanic exhalations of the region. The water was alive with hidden reefs, black rocks that lurked just beneath the surface. Here was where the captain insisted they not go further. He directed the Sparrowhawk into a small inlet, shielded by a curve of rocky coast. The beach was black sand, littered with jagged fragments of obsidian. John watched as the crew lowered a small skiff into the shallows, carefully packing it with minimal supplies. Fresh water, some salted meat, a bit of dried fruit. They provided a pair of oars, a simple mast with a single sail in case of favorable winds. It was hardly a vessel suitable for braving cursed waters, but it was all they would offer. John understood. Captain Faratho approached him, looking uneasy. "If you go further, the wind might carry you, or it might not," he said. "I can't promise safe passage. I can't promise you'll return. If you choose to turn back, I'll wait here 2 days for you to change your mind. After that, my men will want to leave." "Men will see." John clasped the captain's forearm in thanks. "I won't turn back. If I don't return in 2 days, sail on with my gratitude." He finished paying what he owed, then looked out at the desolate stretch of water. The horizon was a smudge of haze, the silhouettes of distant, broken spires just visible. Something deep in his blood seemed to stir at the sight. The ancient heart of Valyria Dado. He walked down the plank into the skiff, Ghost leaping in beside him. The boat rocked under the direwolf's weight. John placed his hand on the oar, glancing over his shoulder at the men who stood by the rail of the Sparrowhawk, some crossing themselves, others simply watching in grim silence. He gave a final nod to the captain. Then he pushed away from the side of the larger ship, drifting into the dark waters, under a sky that seemed to brood over ancient sins. He rowed slowly at first, feeling the water's resistance, watching as the Sparrowhawk receded. Once he was far enough, he raised the small sail. The wind caught it tentatively, pulling the skiff southward, deeper into the realm of ruin. Ghost sat at the prow, ears forward, body tense as if sensing the charge in the air. The light grew strange, neither day nor twilight, but a perpetual haze that muted the sun. The water took on a dull sheen, and the smell shifted, tinged with volcanic fumes. John breathed in, heart thumping. He could not say what he hoped to find. Perhaps the simplest answer was that he needed a place where his sense of self, of fate, might be tested without the judgments of men. In Valyria's ashes, maybe the ghosts of the past would speak to him. Maybe he would find a reason to go on, or else he would let himself be consumed. The skiff glided onward, bearing him deeper into the unknown. And in the silent hollowness of the smoking sea, the last living son of House Targaryen sought answers that lay beyond the scope of mortal men. Ka, Ingat Shand and more, Atiwardi. John kept his eyes on the haze that lay before him, a low-hanging pall that seemed almost alive in its slow, seething drift over the ocean's surface. Beneath the skiff's hull, the waters were eerily calm, their color a dark slate mottled with streaks of ashen gray. He had never sailed into anything like this. Even in the far north, where blizzards could blind a man at midday, he had felt something resembling order in the world. Here, the air itself felt misshapen, tainted by the heavy tang of sulfur and the faint metallic taste that clung to his tongue. Each breath was laborious, like inhaling fumes from a distant furnace. As the small sail strained in the uncertain breeze, he guided the rudder, adjusting course by small degree. Ghost sat at the bow, tail curled around his paws, nose lifted as though testing the strange smells that came from every direction. The day blurred into a peculiar twilight, the sun half lost behind a stained curtain of clouds that glowed faintly red at the edges. Shadows shifted at the corners of John's vision, perhaps illusions born of swirling mist or the distortion of the thick air. He recalled the stories. Men who ventured into these waters only to return half mad, raving of twisted sea serpents and half-formed wraiths that roamed the abandoned spires of the old empire. It was said the doom had shattered not just the land, but the laws of nature around it. Against his chest, John could feel the faint hammering of his heart, yet there was a calm, resigned acceptance in him as well. He had come this far and would not turn back unless this sea itself cast him out. He dared to angle the skiff closer to one of the looming shapes that rose from the horizon, a tangle of jagged basalt columns that might have once been part of a fortress. The ocean lapped at their bases, leaving black foam behind. As he neared, he realized that the stone glistened with a moist film, and here and there, fluorescent lichen cast an eerie glow when the light dimmed. The wind shifted unpredictably, one moment pushing him forward, the next spinning him in place. John trimmed the sail and took up the oars, determined to keep some measure of control. Ghost pawed at the skiff's prow, emitting a low, rumbling growl that reverberated over the hush of the water. A lazy eddy tugged the boat sideways, and John heaved the oars in quick, strong strokes, feeling the muscles in his shoulders burn. Perspiration trickled down his temples despite the gloom. The sea's surface slurped at the hull, as though hungry for any sign of life. He skimmed past a chunk of broken statue half submerged in the waves. A massive hand of pale marble, fingers outstretched in a perpetual plea. It might once have been part of some Valyrian monument, an echo of a civilization that boasted immeasurable power. Now it lay drowned, half consumed by barnacles and algae, like a rotting carcass of a fallen titan. The sight sparked an unwelcome sense of awe in John. This was no mere ruin of a keep or tower. This was the downfall of an entire world that had once dwarfed any kingdom Westeros had ever known. A swirl of mist drifted across the sea, hiding the statue and surrounding rocks from view. John slowed his rowing, drifting into the cloudy gloom. The hush was near absolute, broken only by the soft squeak of the oarlocks and the slow dripping of water from the blades. His breath felt tight in his throat, every inhalation laced with the stale, sulfurous odor. The boat rocked underfoot. He tugged on the rope that controlled the small sail, keeping it taut enough to catch any breath of wind that might propel him through this lifeless domain. Ghost raised his muzzle, ears pricked, then growled again. John eased off his rowing, letting the skiff glide so he could listen. Something moved in the fog, a scrape, a rasp, or perhaps only the echo of distant currents. He felt a tingle on his skin, the sense that eyes were upon him. Turning his head slowly, he peered into the dull haze. No shape emerged, no silhouette loomed, only swirling tendrils of vapor that parted and reformed, as if shaped by an unseen hand. His heart pounded, but his mind remained steady. He had stood against wights and dragons. He would not let a restless fog unman him. Still, he fingered the hilt of Long Claw, feeling the comfortable familiarity of the pommel beneath his palm. A sudden gust snapped the sail, propelling the skiff forward. The mist shredded around him, revealing an expanse of open water again. From the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a shape slide off one of the basalt spires. A smooth, dripping form that vanished beneath the waves with barely a ripple. He whirled, searching, but found nothing. Ghost's fur stood on end, lips curled to bare teeth, but the direwolf made no sound. John frowned. Perhaps only his imagination, fed by the grim tales. Yet a lingering unease hovered in the back of his mind. Valyria's remnants did not care for trespassers, if any intangible force could care at all. The daylight grew weaker, or so it seemed, as though each passing hour drained color from the world. Eventually, John had to concede that dusk was coming, though the transition was so subtle he wasn't sure if it was truly night, or just the endless gloom. In the fading light, he spotted what looked like a labyrinth of stone arches rising from the water. Some were collapsed, others joined at impossible angles. They might have been part of an aqueduct or a grand hall, now half sunk into the ocean. It was a curious structure, too regular to be natural, yet too broken to discern any cohesive design. He directed the skiff closer, searching for a place to shelter overnight. To let himself drift with no anchor in these waters seemed foolhardy. As he neared, he realized the stone was not uniform. It was fused with veins of black glass, the obsidian that formed when molten rock cooled in cataclysmic events. He recalled the stories of the doom, how the very earth had split apart in fountains of flame, scarring the land with rivers of lava. The fused stone was all that remained of once proud buildings, melted and reshaped into nightmare geometry. With careful strokes, John guided the skiff into a small cove formed by two arches that leaned against each other. Beneath them, a narrow space of calm water offered partial shelter from the relentless currents. Ghost crouched, peering over the side. The swirling reflections of gray clouds overhead rippled across the water's surface. John let the sail down, tied off the skiff to a protrusion of blackened rock, and tested the hold with a few sharp tugs. Satisfied it would hold, he stood and stretched, rolling his stiff neck. Hunger gnawed at him. He rummaged in his supplies, a few strips of dried salt beef, some stale bread, and a canteen of fresh water. It would have to do. As he chewed on the tough meat, he listened to the quiet lapping of the ocean against the stone. Every so often, a faint rumble could be heard, as if from deep underground. The 14 flames, he remembered. Those volcanoes still slumbered or smoldered, perhaps trembling with the memory of the great eruption that ended an empire. He offered Ghost a portion of the dried meat, though the direwolf sniffed at it without enthusiasm. The beast seemed unsettled, ears never quite relaxing, nose twitching at the faintest trace of an unfamiliar scent. John placed a hand on Ghost's flank, feeling the tension in the animal's body. He recalled the old superstition that animals could sense evil or spirits, or some primal threat that men were blind to. A wry smile ghosted across his lips. If that were true, there was likely plenty here to disturb a wolf's instincts. Darkness thickened until John could see little beyond the faint glimmer of starlight through the haze. The moon was hidden behind layers of ashen cloud, granting no clarity. He settled onto the wooden bench in the skiff, Longclaw drawn across his lap, and let his eyes adjust to the gloom. A heavy stillness weighed on the air, broken only by an occasional drip of water from the arches above. He let his thoughts wander, reflecting on how far he had come, from the wind-swept battlements of the wall to this forsaken realm. The old vow rang in his mind: I shall live and die at my post. But he had died, and death had not claimed him. Now, in this second life, his post was no longer the wall. Fate had led him here instead. Sleep came grudgingly, in fitful doses. He would drift off for moments, only to jolt awake at some imagined sound. An echo of stone, a distant hiss. A few times, he heard something splash in the water, and Ghost would raise his head, eyes glowing crimson in the darkness. Yet nothing emerged to threaten them, and the night, such as it was, dragged on. When he finally succumbed to a deeper slumber, he dreamed of dark corridors lined with dragon skulls, a presence at his back, urging him onward. He saw pale-haired figures in swirling robes, chanting words he couldn't understand. Then he was falling into a sea of molten rock, arms flailing, and the dream shattered. He awoke gasping, the gloom unchanged. His muscles were stiff, and the taste of sulfur lingered on his tongue. At some unmarked hour, the sky brightened slightly, telling him dawn might have arrived. He roused himself, gave Ghost another portion of dried meat, and ate a small breakfast of stale bread, soaked in water. A day or a night had passed. He was no longer sure how to measure time in this place. Regardless, he untied the boat, hoisted the sail, and pushed back into the open water. The sense of foreboding, if anything, had intensified, but he pressed on. Soon, the labyrinth of arches faded behind him in the swirling mist, and new shapes took form. Slag heaps of blackened rock, tall columns of obsidian, some twisted as if wrenched into knots by unimaginable heat. The ocean floor must have been shallow here. He sometimes glimpsed jagged ridges beneath the surface, perilous to any ship larger than his small skiff. The water glowed with strange colors, weird tinges that might have been reflections of underwater volcanic vents. He steered around them carefully, mindful that a single collision could crack his hull and leave him adrift. As midday approached, or what he guessed to be midday. A restless wind picked up, pushing him further south. Hot gusts carried swirling flakes of ash, as if some far-off mountain still belched cinders into the sky. The smell of brimstone grew stronger. His eyes watered. Even Ghost sneezed and shook his head. John soaked a scrap of cloth in his canteen, pressing it over his mouth and nose to ease the stinging. He wondered at the madness of his mission. Yet each time doubt surfaced, he recalled the emptiness he had felt standing on the wall, the sense that he did not belong there. He had been born of dragon's blood, and if dragons had once thrived in this land, perhaps it held answers he couldn't find elsewhere. Toward evening, if such concept still applied, John spotted the skeletal outline of an ancient galley run aground on a jut of volcanic rock. Its hull was cracked and scorched, the prow splintered. Time and the elements had reduced its sails to tatters, but the shape was distinctly Valyrian in style, long and sleek, meant for war or trade in an era long past. He rowed closer, curiosity stirring. The deck was half submerged, the remains of rotted planks coated in black barnacles. He thought of trying to board it, but the timbers looked ready to disintegrate at a touch. Instead, he guided the skiff around the wreck, searching for any sign of life or salvageable items. Just as he reached the stern, he caught sight of movement, a flicker of something inside the broken hull. He paused, letting the boat drift. Ghost stood, growling softly, tail stiff. In the hull's shadow, a shape shifted. A hunched figure, slick and dark, perched like a wet crow. John narrowed his eyes, struggling to make out its form. It seemed vaguely human, but stooped with elongated limbs. When the creature turned its head, he saw a flash of pallid skin stretched taut over bone, eyes sunken and lightless. For a moment, they locked gazes. Then it emitted a rasping hiss and dropped from the wreck into the water with barely a splash. Joan's heart hammered. He had read accounts in half-mad sailors' journals about survivors of the Doom or their descendants, said to be twisted by the cursed land. But those stories had always been dismissed as tall tales or illusions born of feverish nightmares. Yet he had just glimpsed something undeniably real, an abomination of flesh and bone, lurking among the rotted boards of a centuries-old vessel. He debated rowing closer, but caution kept him back. If there were more of those creatures beneath the surface, he was in no condition to fight them, especially if they attacked the boat. He settled for scanning the water until he was certain the creature had vanished. Ghost growled once more, then settled with a cautious glare at the sea. John continued onward, unsettled, but more determined than ever. This land, this ocean, was haunted by the echoes of what had been. If the living still prowled here, shaped by foul magic or the residue of doom, then perhaps other secrets endured, hidden in caverns or spires. The Targaryens who had escaped the Doom had brought their dragons to Dragonstone, forging a new legacy in Westeros. But what of those who had stayed? What of knowledge lost to the Cataclysm? Knowledge that might explain the bond between Valyrian steel and the fires of creation. The day slipped by in a haze of drifting ash, every breath tasting of old embers. Eventually, John found another formation of black stone that rose above the water, forming a rough platform. He approached it cautiously, letting the skiff bump against the rock. It seemed stable enough to stand on. He tied off the boat, tested the rock with his weight, and climbed out. Ghost followed, paws scraping on the rough surface. The stone radiated warmth as if it had just been baked by an unseen sun, though the air was not hot enough to explain it. Veins of red glowed faintly in cracks, like the embers of a dying fire deep within the earth. John climbed higher, searching for a vantage point. The outcrop was layered, each terrace leading to a small plateau, until at last he reached a spot near the top. From here, he had a better view of the surrounding sea. It stretched in all directions, broken by the silhouettes of more ruins, towers and parapets, blackened peaks half hidden in swirling clouds of ash. The sky above was dim and patchy. Far to the west, he glimpsed something flickering crimson, perhaps the molten peak of one of the 14 flames. He stood in silence, letting the magnitude of the ancient destruction wash over him. Once, these lands had been the seat of the greatest empire in history. powerful enough to shape continents. Now it was a graveyard where the natural laws of the world seemed bent and twisted. Suddenly, Ghost gave a low bark. John turned to see what had spooked him. The direwolf stood near a small hollow in the rock, ears flattened, nose quivering. John approached carefully, peering inside. There, in the darkness, something glinted. A reflection of the faint red glow. He knelt, hand on Longclaw, and reached his other hand slowly into the hollow, half expecting something to leap out at him. But there was no movement, only cold stone. His fingers brushed against a smooth metallic edge. He grasped it and pulled. A thin dagger came free, its blade dark and shimmering. Valyrian steel. He recognized the subtle patterns rippling along the metal's length. He turned it in the dim light, marveling that it seemed entirely untouched by rust or tarnish. The hilt was plain, made of black dragon bone, cracked with age, but the blade remained pristine. How had it ended up lodged here? Had someone hidden it in a moment of desperation? Or had it been flung here by the violent forces of the doom? Though the blade was remarkable, a faint shiver crawled up John's spine. The dagger felt cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so, as if it drew heat from his hand. He recalled Maester Aemon's words about Valyrian steel carrying a piece of magic within it. Some forging technique lost to time, melding dragonfire and incantations. Carefully, he sheathed it in a makeshift scabbard fashioned from cloth. He was wary of carrying another relic from these ruins, but part of him believed it might be important. Or perhaps he simply couldn't leave such a relic behind. He stayed on the outcrop until the sky dimmed further, watching the horizon for any sign of trouble. He saw shapes moving in the distance, flocks of strange birds, or perhaps remnants of roiling smoke. Eventually, he descended to where his skiff was tied. The rock glowed under his boots, as if lit from below by smoldering coals. He settled himself in the boat once more, letting Ghost jump in first to keep it steady. The day's effort weighed heavily on him, and though the idea of drifting at night in these waters terrified him, he had little choice. He cast off, hoping to find a more sheltered place to anchor. Rowing slowly, he navigated through corridors of black stone that rose from the sea like the ribs of a great beast. A gloom hung over everything, tinted by the ruddy glow of volcanic emissions. Now and then, ghostly lights flickered along the water's surface, could have been reflections of the flaming mountains, or something else entirely. Time became meaningless. His arms ached from the effort of propelling the boat. The monotony of the environment, the endless hush broken by distant rumbles, threatened to lull him into a stupor. But fear kept him alert. At last, he found a small inlet, partly enclosed by a crumpled wall of fused rock. The water here was calmer, though swirling eddies suggested hidden currents. Exhausted, John let the skiff drift into this shallow cove, carefully avoiding sharp rocks. He tossed a small anchor, really just a heavy stone tied to a rope, over the side to keep from floating away. The water was shallow enough that he could see the bottom, coated in black sand and shimmering fragments of obsidian. A single arch of stone overhead gave partial shelter from the ash that occasionally drifted down like black snow. With a low groan, John stretched his limbs and found what little space he could to lie back in the skiff. Ghost curled at his feet, ears twitching. John's eyelids felt weighted with lead. He tried to maintain a watch, but after the day's labor, sleep pulled at him relentlessly. Before he succumbed, he glanced up through the arch at the swirling sky. No stars, no moon, only the dull red luminescence of roiling clouds. The memory of that hunched creature in the wrecked ship haunted him, along with the knowledge that any number of horrors might lurk beneath these waters. Nevertheless, he had to rest. He placed one hand on Longclaw, the other on the newly found Valyrian dagger, then let his exhaustion claim him. His dreams were vivid and unkind. He saw Winterfell's courtyard covered in ash, not snow. His siblings' faces blurred by falling cinders. He walked through empty corridors lit by firelight, hearing voices whisper in High Valyrian. Words he couldn't fully grasp. Then the scene shifted, and he stood in a chamber of black glass. A great mosaic on the floor, depicting dragons, twisting around a central flame. A figure knelt at the mosaic's center, draped in tattered robes. When it turned, its face was skeletal, eyes burning with a pale fire. It beckoned him closer, chanting in a language older than men. John tried to turn away, but the figure's voice echoed within his skull. He found himself stepping forward against his will. The flames in the mosaic rose up, consuming him, and he let out a cry. He woke covered in sweat, the cove still dark. Ghost stood over him, licking at his face in concern. Heart hammering, John sat up, inhaling the acrid air. He pressed a hand to his temple, forcing himself to breathe steadily. It was only a dream, or so he told himself. But the sense of dread remained, lingering on his skin like a film of soot. Outside the arch, the water was still, reflective of the faint red glow overhead. There was no sign of approaching dawn, or any measurable shift in time. Pushing aside his unease, he ate another meager ration, gave Ghost what he could spare, then readied the skiff to continue. By the time he rowed out of the cove, the gloom had lightened slightly, suggesting some manner of daybreak. He headed south again, guided only by the memory of half-ruined charts and the position of the dim, hidden sun. Occasionally he glimpsed traces of color in the sky, a bruised purple hue or a shimmer of orange behind roiling smoke. Hours passed in repetitive motion, each stroke of the oars a measured effort to find any landmark that might stand out. Eventually, he beheld a sight that made him pause. A grand ruin emerging from the haze, taller than any he had seen thus far. Towering spires of black stone, their surfaces pitted and cracked, jutted into the sky like claws. Some were collapsed, but others stood defiantly, forming what appeared to be a massive crumbling skyline. The waters around them were shallow, revealing black rock that might once have been paved streets. Could this be the heart of old Valyria, the capital city that had once rivaled any wonder of the known world? Now half sunk in the smoking sea, John's pulse quickened. This was what he had come for. Some tangible remnant of the civilization that had shaped his ancestry. He guided the skiff into the maze of broken columns and half-submerged structures, weaving carefully around the treacherous reefs. Ghost stood, ears perked, gazing at the ruins with an intensity that John had not seen before. There was an uncanny stillness here, as though time had congealed along with the molten rock. The air felt heavier than ever. He found a place where the remains of an ancient quay jutted from the water in a series of wide steps. With some effort, he nudged the skiff alongside, then used a rope to tie it off to a rusted iron ring set in the stone. Testing his footing, he stepped onto the cracked platform. The stone was warm, even through his boots, and an odd steam rose from the joints. Chunks of obsidian littered the quay, and collapsed pillars blocked easy passage. But there was enough room for him to climb farther inland. He helped Ghost ashore, the direwolf's claws clicking on the broken pavement. What lay ahead was a labyrinth of fallen halls and half-collapsed arches. John moved cautiously, aware that any structure might crumble if he disturbed it. The ground was scorched black in places, fused in others. Great basalt columns twisted upward, many broken at unnatural angles. Some walls bore faint carvings, intricate patterns of dragons, stylized flames, and glyphs that might be letters of old Valyrian script. He ran his fingertips over one such carving, half lost to cracks and centuries of erosion. Yet the artistry was still evident, evoking a culture that had blended magic and architecture seamlessly. He ventured deeper, picking his way through what had once been broad avenues, now choked by rubble and pools of stagnant water. Steam seeped from fissures in the ground. He felt the hairs on his arms prickle as he passed near them, suspecting toxic gases might be venting from subterranean chambers. More than once, he spotted bones. Some clearly human, charred and fragmented, others too large and misshapen to be anything but dragon remains. The bones lay scattered, sometimes fused with the melted remnants of stone or metal. It was as if the cataclysm had struck without mercy, freezing life in a final moment of agony. Ghost sniffed warily at the skeletal remains of what might have been a dragon hatchling, its ribcage splayed across a patch of blackened ground. The skull still bore tiny horns, The jaw parted in a silent roar. John felt a strange sorrow, imagining the creature's final moments. Perhaps it had never even taken flight. He wanted to say a prayer for it, but he did not know which gods held dominion here. The old gods of the north were silent, and the faith of the seven felt distant. Roller had power in heat and flame, but John could not bring himself to pray to the fire god either, not after all he had seen. He moved on, careful to keep track of his route so he might return to the skiff. The deeper he went, the grander the ruins became. Cyclopean walls loomed overhead, carved with serpentine dragons, entire battle scenes frozen in sculpted basalt. He passed through a collapsed gate that might once have been gilded, stepping into what could only have been a massive courtyard. Broken columns, each taller than a tower in Winterfell, ringed the space. In the center rose a dais of fused stone, large enough for dozens of people to stand upon. At the dais's edges lay heaps of rubble that might have been steps, partially melted by intense heat. As John approached the dais, he felt an inexplicable wave of vertigo. The air seemed to shimmer, as if drenched in the heat of a forge. He stumbled, knees buckling briefly, and Longclaw rattled in its scabbard. Ghost let out a soft whine, pacing beside him anxiously. Steadying himself, John climbed the dais, eyes darting around for threats. Nothing moved in the shadows. Yet, his skin prickled with a sense of being watched. Atop the dais, he found an ancient platform, scorched and cracked. In its center lay a fragment of what must have been a grand statue. A dragon's head carved in black stone, half of it sheared away. Intricate patterns were etched along its ridges, suggesting it once had precious metals or jewels embedded. John knelt beside the massive piece, trying to imagine the statue intact. Perhaps it had loomed over the city, a testament to Valyria's might. Now it lay broken, the emptiness of its eye sockets staring blankly at him. He touched the stone gingerly. It was warm, but not scalding. As he did, a memory unspooled in his mind. An image of Daenerys Targaryen, standing tall amid the ruin of King's Landing, the ashes falling around her like snow. He remembered the pain of that moment, the choice he had made. Had she ever dreamed of seeing Valyria reborn? She who was the mother of dragons. Or was her destiny always set on another path? He pushed the thought aside, swallowing the knot in his throat. A sudden shift in the air made him turn. For an instant, it seemed that a figure stood at the periphery of the courtyard. A tall, robed shape with hair the color of moonlight. The figure vanished the moment he tried to focus on it, leaving only swirling ash. John's heart leapt into his throat. He rose, drawing Longclaw. The blade glinted faintly in the ruddy half-light, runes dancing on the rippled steel. Ghost too was on alert, staring at the same point with hackles raised. John took slow, measured steps, scanning the courtyard's edges. Nothing, not a breath of movement, only dust and ash drifting through archways and broken columns. But had it truly been a trick of the light? He circled the dais, searching every shadow. At one point, he thought he heard the faint scrape of a footstep echo against stone. Yet no living being manifested, nothing skittered away. There was only emptiness. Had the land itself conjured illusions to torment him? Or was some presence lingering here? John recalled his dream, the skeletal figure chanting in a language he did not know. A chill threaded through him, though the air was hot. Eventually, he lowered Longclaw, forcing his mind to remain calm. Whatever that phantom was, it did not attack. He turned his attention to the courtyard's edges, where collapsed doorways might lead to interior chambers. He reasoned that if there were valuable records or artifacts left, they might be found in the deeper recesses of these structures, protected from the elements. Part of him questioned the wisdom of delving further. Each step brought new dangers, poisonous fumes, unstable ceilings, or worse. Yet he had come to Valyria for answers, and some impulse drove him onward. John took one last look at the shattered dragon head on the dais, then moved toward a wide arch that led into darkness. Ghost followed, staying close. Inside, the light was minimal, the gloom broken by occasional shafts of red illumination from cracks in the walls. The floor slanted downward, as though the entire building had partially sunk. He kept a hand on the wall to maintain balance, feeling the slickness of condensed steam under his fingers. The corridor branched ahead, one path choked with fallen rubble, another leading into a yawning blackness. His foot struck something metallic. He looked down to see a rusted helm, its visor parted. A rotted leather strap lay beside it, perhaps once part of a harness. The helm was pitted with age but still bore ornamental dragon's wings on either side. He nudged it aside gently, revealing a cluster of bones beneath. A collapsed ribcage, fragments of cloth. He wondered if this was a Valyrian soldier, or a traveler from centuries after the Doom who had dared to explore these ruins. In either case, the outcome was the same. Death in darkness, bones left for no one to mourn. Pressing on, he stepped through the open arch into a broader chamber. Light seeped from a fissure high above, revealing a domed ceiling of astonishing craftsmanship. Even in ruin, the dome bore intricate mosaics in obsidian and gold. Though much of the gold had melted into twisted lumps, the design depicted dragons in flight around a central sun, or perhaps a stylized volcano, with swirling patterns that might represent smoke or flame. The sense of age here was profound. John felt like an uninvited guest in a tomb far older than anything in Westeros. He heard water dripping somewhere to his left. The floor's tilt led him to a wide crack in the wall, behind which water trickled steadily. Perhaps a submerged fountain, or an underground stream forced to the surface by shifting rock. The air was stifling. He wiped sweat from his brow, trying not to inhale too deeply. Ghost sniffed the ground, pausing at intervals to scrape at the stone with a paw. John made his way toward a row of alcoves that lined one side of the chamber. In some, statues remained, weathered figures of robed men and women, presumably Valyrian nobility or priests. Their features had been eroded into anonymity, and in places they were fused with lava flows that had once scoured the city. One alcove stood empty, save for a pile of debris. Another contained a statue that had toppled forward, face down on the floor. He carefully stepped around it, noticing a faint glimmer of something nestled beneath the fallen sculpture. Curiosity piqued. He tried to shift the statue, but it was too heavy. Instead, he knelt and reached underneath, groping in the dark space. His fingers brushed what felt like a metal cylinder, small and capped at both ends. He worked it free, pulling out a charred scroll case of hammered brass. The surface was blackened, likely from intense heat. The ends were sealed with half-melted lids. Gingerly, he tested if they would open. One lid cracked and flaked away, revealing a brittle parchment inside. Heart quickening, John slid out the parchment, surprised it had not crumbled into dust. The edges were singed, but the center remained intact. Delicate lines and script adorned the page, written in an ornate style. This was Valyrian glyphs, older than the Targaryen simplified form. He recognized only a few symbols from Sam's lessons, but the parchment also contained diagrams, circles within circles, lines connecting certain runes. Perhaps a spell, a piece of old lore, or a record of arcane knowledge. A jolt of excitement and trepidation coursed through him. Here in his hands was a scrap of true Valyrian writing, preserved against all odds. Could it hold clues to the forging of Valyrian steel, or the secrets of the dragon's bond with their riders? Or was it something far darker, best left buried? He gently rolled the parchment, sliding it back into the case to protect it. He knew that even reading it might be fraught with peril, especially if the text contained references to blood magic or curses. But he could not simply discard it. Knowledge, for better or worse, had always been the weapon of the learned. Rising, he tucked the scroll case into his pack, feeling the weight of it as if it were a living thing. Ghost nudged his leg, urging him toward the exit. As much as John wanted to linger and search for more relics, he could sense the danger pressing in from all sides, as if the city itself resented his trespass. Each shift of the stone overhead, each drip of water, threatened to become a collapse. He resolved to return to the skiff before the labyrinth swallowed him. Retracing his steps, he passed the scattered bones and broken columns, stepping back into the half-light of the courtyard. The days and the shattered dragon head waited in dismal silence, crowned by drifting ash. He heard no footsteps, saw no phantom figures this time, yet the air felt charged, like a moment before a storm's breaking. With careful haste, he crossed the courtyard and navigated the rubble-strewn avenues. More than once, he paused at the sound of faint whispers on the edge of hearing, breaths of wind or echoes of distant voices. He could not tell. Eventually he saw the water again through a gap in the walls, the dull reflection of gloom. His skiff bobbed where he left it, waiting like a lonely sentinel. Relief flooded him. He had half expected to find it gone, or broken, or dragged away by those twisted creatures. Ghost bounded ahead, leaping onto the quay steps. John followed, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The boat was intact, still tied to the iron ring. Carefully he stepped in, calming his anxious mind. He loosened the rope, stowed the precious scroll case in a secured pouch, and lifted the oars. Before he could push off, a sudden tremor rippled through the stone beneath him. It was mild, but enough to make the quay tremble and send small rocks skittering into the water. A deep groan echoed from within the city ruins, as though the land itself was shifting in restless sleep. John's gaze snapped to the spires, half expecting one to collapse in a spray of rubble. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Then a crack resounded, and one of the distant towers shuddered, a portion of its upper ramparts collapsing inward. Dust and debris rose in a plume, swallowed swiftly by the swirling haze. He set his jaw. That was his cue to depart. He tested the sail. There was a slight wind, enough to help him navigate through the broken channels. With Ghost standing watch at the bow, he guided the skiff away from the drowned quay, weaving between sunken streets and half-toppled columns. Every so often, the water churned with subterranean heat, sending bubbles of steam rising to the surface. The city receded behind him, its black spires melting back into the haze. Yet John carried a piece of it with him now. A blade of Valyrian steel he'd found in the rock, and a scroll of unknown knowledge. Treasures or curses, he could not say. He looked back only once, seeing the place as a jagged silhouette against the crimson-tinged clouds. A hiss of distant wind blurred its edges, transforming it into a dream or a nightmare. His heart pounded with mingled relief and longing. Part of him wanted to remain to dig deeper into the city's secrets. Another part knew that to linger was to court certain destruction. For now, he would follow the water, searching for safer ground or a path beyond this ring of doom. As he rowed, his mind swirled with questions. The parchment, would he even be able to decipher it? Sam might have managed with time and references, but John was no lore master. Still, perhaps there were scholars in the free cities who might offer insight, though few would willingly handle relics from Valyria. Or, he considered grimly, maybe it was best kept hidden, lest it awaken evils better left in the grave. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on him. He had come in search of understanding, and he had found fragments of it. Now he needed to decide what to do next. Gradually, the waters widened. The tall rock formations gave way to smaller ridges, the rubble of lesser settlements lost in time. The air remained stifling, but the noxious stench of sulfur eased slightly. A pale sun attempted to pierce the ash clouds overhead, lending the waves a sullen gleam. The boat bobbed in a slow, rhythmic motion, and John realized with a start that he might be emerging from the heart of the smoking sea. Had he navigated a ring around the worst of its hazards? Or was this merely a lull before some new terror? Ghost rested his muzzle on the skiff's edge, ears twitching. John stroked the direwolf's neck, taking comfort in that steady presence. They had survived the ruin of Valyria, or at least its outskirts. Survived to wonder at what they had glimpsed. In the distance, he could make out a partial ring of black cliffs rising from the water, like a curtain that separated this region from the open seas beyond. If he could find a gap, perhaps he might slip out into less accursed waters. The notion filled him with cautious hope. Yet even as the sky lightened fractionally, John felt the grim pulse of the place in his veins, as if the land's ancient magic recognized something in him. Targaryen blood, or the lingering spark of a life returned. He recalled the phantom figure in the courtyard. the robed silhouette that vanished in ash. Perhaps it was only a trick of his weary mind, or perhaps the souls of Valyria still wandered, searching for a means to reclaim what was lost. The wind stirred, carrying a final swirl of acrid dust across the boat. John shivered despite the heat, remembering the swirl of shadows he had seen. Whatever the truth, the city had released him for now, allowing him to escape with a token of its memory. As the boat drifted onward, he turned his gaze forward, scanning the horizon for a route beyond the black cliffs. The waves lapped at the hull, each slap a rhythmic beat that steadied his nerves. He did not know where his path led next, only that he would keep going until he found a place to breathe freely again. The air smelled faintly cleaner as he rode toward the curtain of cliffs, though the tang of ash still lingered at the back of his throat. Each pull of the oars echoed off the looming basalt walls, the sound magnified in strange harmonies. A sharp gust threatened to yank the skiff sideways, but John kept a firm hand on the tiller, determined not to let the water dash him against the rocks. Soon, he noticed a narrow cleft cutting through the cliffs, a jagged passage that curved out of sight. Waves foamed in the entrance, and the rocky sides glistened with algae and slick deposits. He angled the skiff toward it, hoping it led to open sea. The gloom behind him pressed like an unwanted memory. Ghost rose, alert to the change in the environment. John trimmed the sail, letting the wind carry them into the cleft. The water churned with hidden currents, forcing him to row hard to avoid scraping the jagged walls. The passage wound in a slow arc, narrowing at points until he feared the skiff might not fit. But each time, it widened just enough, allowing him to press through. Suddenly, a rush of fresh air greeted him. The cleft opened into a broad expanse of ocean beneath a sky that was no longer entirely hidden by ash. Clouds still shrouded the sun, but they were normal clouds, untainted by the roiling storms of Valyria. John glanced back only once, seeing the black cliffs recede, a foreboding gateway to the domain of nightmares. He exhaled a long breath, shoulders sagging with relief. Ghost let out a single, echoing bark, as if to mark the moment. Though he had emerged from Valyria's grasp, he carried its mark within him, memories of molten ruins, of illusions in the ash, of the dagger and the scroll case he now possessed. Whether they would bring him peace or trouble, he could not say. For now the open sea stretched before him, a promise of possibilities. He adjusted the sail, closed his aching eyes for a brief moment, and let the tide carry him forward. A chapter of his journey had ended, but the story was far from complete. He was a man unbound by oaths that had once anchored him, drifting between fate and chance. And somewhere beyond these waters, the realm still spun its intrigues and wars, unaware that Jon Snow had ventured into the corpse of an empire and returned with a secret that might yet reshape the future, or destroy him. Oh, hey. Jon drifted on the open water, still achingly aware of the hush behind him. The channel of black cliffs receded, not so much disappearing as dissolving into the haze that ringed the cursed lands. A shift in the wind teased him along, gentle but firm, as though coaxing him into safer reaches. Yet even as relief mingled with the salty air, he felt a gnawing hollowness, a sense that the smoking sea had imprinted itself upon him. He took up the oars, giving himself something to do, letting the tension bleed through each stroke. The small sail could carry him part way, but the wind was fickle, gusting one moment and lying still the next. Ghost lay across the bow, limbs extended, muzzle resting on the edge as he peered over the dark waves. Jon pushed onward, though he had no precise course. All he knew was that east or west, north or south, any direction away from Valyria, would eventually lead to new waters. Perhaps he might find a known trade route or cross paths with a fishing vessel. He recalled the last smugglers who'd borne him part of the journey, how their fear had kept them from venturing farther. He understood that fear all too well now. The hours merged in a grim, silent dance of sea and sky. Little by little the pall of ash lifted. The sun made timid forays through thinning clouds, sending glints of silver across the waves. Even the color of the water changed, from that haunted gray to a deeper blue that hinted at life stirring below the surface. Now and again, Jon glimpsed the movement of fish in the shallows, or the silhouette of a seabird above. Small signs, but enough to reassure him that he was leaving the cursed realm behind. When exhaustion forced him to rest, he set the oars aside and let the boat drift. Ghost seemed content to lap at the water or watch the horizon with half-lidded eyes. John chewed on a scrap of dried meat, sipping sparingly from his waterskin. He had to ration what remained. Fresh water would be his greatest need if he didn't find land or a friendly ship soon. The glaring sun made his throat tighter, his lips beginning to crack. Yet for all that, he preferred the taste of dryness and salt to the sulfuric reek that lingered behind him. The sky here was open, untainted by nightmares. In the afternoon, or what he guessed to be afternoon, he spotted a cluster of shapes on the horizon, rocky outcroppings that might form an islet or a chain of reefs. The relief of seeing anything besides endless water spurred him forward. He trimmed the sail to catch the shifting breeze. The skiff bobbed and rocked, propelled in a gentle surge. Ghost stood, tail low, but wagging once or twice as though he too felt a spark of cautious hope. They reached the outcroppings by dusk. It was a lonely scatter of stone and coral, no larger than the training yard at Castle Black. Jagged spires rose from the water, forming tide pools in which sea urchins nestled. Gulls wheeled overhead, raucous but free, a sure sign that fish were plentiful. John guided the skiff into a shallow inlet. The hull scraped against sand. He hopped out into knee-deep water, then coaxed Ghost to follow. The direwolf sprang ashore with a single leap, sniffing at the rocks. John hauled the skiff up onto the gritty strand, grateful for a chance to stretch his legs. The island was mostly bare stone, with just a scattering of stunted shrubs clinging to crevices. He made a quick survey and found a narrow patch of level ground where he could rest for the night. He brushed aside pebbles and shells, then set about searching for anything of use. Pools of brackish water shimmered in the twilight, but it tasted foul, still salty, with no indication of any fresh spring. He exhaled, feeling the pang of thirst. The day's heat had taken its toll, and his water supply was half gone at best. Returning to the boat, he examined his meager stores: a little salted meat, some dried fruit, and the precious waterskin. He thought of the dagger he'd found, that slender shard of Valyrian steel, as well as the brass scroll case. Both were carefully wrapped in cloth to protect them from the elements. Sometimes it felt as though they weighed more than all his supplies combined. He placed them on a dry patch of rock, deciding to inspect them in what remained of the light. He unwrapped the dagger first, holding it up to the last glow of the setting sun. The swirling pattern in the blade was faint but undeniable, glinting with subtle ripples. Despite being ancient, the edge remained keen, as if freshly honed. He had no scabbard for it save for the makeshift covering of cloth. There was a strangeness to its balance too, a slight heaviness near the tip that suggested it had been forged for more than mere utility. The handle was dragon bone, dark with a faint texture like old wood. Turning it over, he noticed engravings so worn they were nearly invisible. Perhaps stylized flames or dragon scales. Whatever they represented, they hinted at a past suffused with magic. He thought of Longclaw, the sword he had carried all these years, also made of Valyrian steel but with a different story behind it. This dagger, by contrast, felt like a whisper from the darkest corners of the Empire's lore. He set it aside with a wary sense of reverence, then unrolled the cloth containing the scroll case. The brass cylinder was scorched and battered, but it had survived the doom and centuries more, only to end up in his hands. He slid out the parchment again, mindful that the evening air might make it brittle. Even so, he couldn't resist taking another look. In the dim light, the glyphs were shadows of themselves. He recognized a few characters, words that meant fire or blood in High Valyrian, though in archaic forms. Others were entirely alien. The diagrams appeared to be concentric circles, lines converging at points marked with runes. Could it be a map of something intangible, like the planes of the heavens? Or was it a formula for forging steel or controlling dragons? He traced a finger along one of the circles, feeling the ridges of ink. A faint prickle ran up his arm, not entirely pleasant. Magic, or his imagination? He replaced the parchment in its case before the night's dampness could ruin it. The question of what to do with this knowledge nagged at him. He supposed he could turn to Old Town's maesters, but they might balk at the origin of such a relic. Or worse, confiscate it in fear of its contents. Another thought seized him. What if Sam were here, the old Sam he had known? The one with boundless curiosity and a knack for puzzles. They might have pored over each glyph by lamplight, forging a plan to glean Valyria's secrets. But Sam was far away, presumably in his own corner of the world, forging a new life. The distance between them felt larger than the sea. He sighed and wrapped his finds again, placing them carefully in the boat. Ghost had wandered off among the rocks, likely hunting for gulls or small crabs. Left alone, John tried to arrange his cloak and a spare scrap of sailcloth into something resembling a bed. The wind off the ocean was mild, but carried an edge of dampness. He eased himself down, letting the aches in his back and shoulders settle. His eyes roamed across the dark horizon. Out here, the sky was a deep star-strewn blanket, far clearer than it had been under the ashen clouds. He found himself gazing at the familiar patterns of stars, the same ones he had seen from the wall, though they appeared just a bit different in these southern latitudes. A wave of sorrow washed over him, remembering nights when he and Sam took turns naming constellations to pass the long vigil. Eventually, weariness claimed him. He drifted in and out of shallow dreams, haunted by half-formed images of molten ruins, glimpses of ghostly figures behind broken walls. Once, he jerked awake, certain he heard a whisper. But the island was silent, save for the crash of distant waves. Nothing moved except Ghost, who returned with a salt-streaked muzzle and a fishy smell. John's heartbeat slowed, and he settled back again, letting the lull of the surf carry him toward a fitful sleep. Morning arrived in a blaze of heat and light, the sky cloudless and the sun glaring. He woke with his lips parched and his forehead beaded with sweat. Ghost panted, uncomfortable with the sudden warmth, and paced the stony shore in search of shade. John's first thought was to preserve his water, but he knew better than to start the day dehydrated. So he drank a few cautious sips, wincing at how quickly the water skin grew lighter. He needed to move on, and quickly. He pushed the skiff back into the sea, nudging the prow over the shallows. Once afloat, he hopped in, bracing the craft as Ghost leapt aboard. The next stage of his journey would depend on catching a favorable current or wind. Scanning the waves, he saw the faint stir of a breeze from the south. He hoisted the little sail, hoping it would carry him westward, perhaps toward the trade lanes that linked Volantis to Lys, or some smaller island chain. Any settlement would be welcome if it meant fresh water and supplies. All day he sailed under the scorching sun, the boat creaking, the canvas flapping. Now and then, he used the oars to guide his course or gain speed when the wind died. The sea glimmered in relentless brightness, a mirror reflecting the merciless sky. Sweat trickled down his back. Hours blended together, a test of endurance as thirst clawed at his throat. He rationed his water to the bare minimum. Ghost sprawled in the boat's shade, tongue lolling, eyes half closed. When hunger forced him to rummage for food, he found only a handful of dried fruit left to accompany the last strips of salted meat. He chewed slowly, forcing saliva as best he could. It was a meager comfort. His mind flickered to the possibility of fishing, but he had no line or net, only a knife. If it came to desperation, he would try to craft something from the sails ropes, though it would cost him precious lengths he might need. He forced the thought aside for the moment. Perhaps luck would favor him soon. At last, near late afternoon, the horizon showed a hint of movement, a swath of color that might indicate land, or perhaps a different shade of sea. He narrowed his eyes against the glare, trying to distinguish shape. As he drew closer, he saw the green outline of trees, the shimmer of a beach, maybe the suggestion of rocky hills behind. A surge of cautious hope carried him. He steered the skiff toward it, urging the sail to catch whatever breeze would help. Ghost stood, ears pricked, clearly sensing the change. By the time the sun neared the horizon, he was close enough to see that it was indeed an island, larger than the barren rock he'd slept on the previous night. Clumps of palm-like trees swayed inland, and he could almost smell the greenery in the moist air. The beach was broad, pale sand flecked with shells and driftwood. He scanned it for signs of habitation, smoke, huts, boats, but saw nothing overt. Still, land was land. It might hold fresh water. He guided the skiff into a gentle surf, letting the boat ride the small breakers onto the sand. He hopped out into the warm shallows, the water lapping at his calves. This time, Ghost followed more eagerly, bounding onto the beach and shaking off the spray. John dragged the skiff a few yards up the sand until it was beyond the tide's reach. He paused to look around, unsettled by how quiet it was. The air felt thick but less sulfuric than near Valyria. A faint breeze rattled the leaves of the tall trees. Birds fluttered overhead. It almost resembled a paradise compared to the cursed waters he had known. But in his experience, such places could hide many dangers. He drew Longclaw and strapped it across his back for easier movement. The newly found dagger rested in its cloth scabbard at his belt too. Then he set off carefully, Ghost at his side. The sand gave way to patches of scrub and tall grasses. He glimpsed small creatures darting among the trunks of the trees, perhaps rodents or reptiles. A cacophony of distant bird calls filled the still air. Within a short walk, he found a rise of ground that sloped upward into thicker vegetation. The ground under his boots turned damp, spongy with patches of moss. If there was a stream or spring anywhere, it might be higher up. He pressed on, pushing aside ferns that towered at chest height. The further he went, the more humidity weighed on him, making his skin slick with sweat. Ghost panted beside him, occasionally veering off to sniff at a hollow log or scratch at tree bark. Soon enough, John's ears caught the sound of trickling water. His heart leapt. He followed it, forging through a stand of broad-leafed plants, until he reached a small clearing, where a crystal-clear stream tumbled over rocks into a shallow pool. The surrounding area was alive with the chirps of insects and the glimmer of colorful birds. He knelt at the edge, ignoring the persistent caution that always whispered about poison or parasites. The water smelled fresh, not brackish or rotten. He scooped a handful to his lips, tasting it carefully. It was cool, a faint tang of minerals, but no bitterness or salt. Relief washed through him in a wave. He drank more deeply, savoring each swallow as it slid down his parched throat. Ghost drank as well, lapping noisily. Once he was sated, John took the water skin from his belt and filled it to the brim. He let the pool's refreshment flood him with renewed life. Some of the tension in his muscles eased, replaced by a grateful ache. For the first time in days, he felt a measure of comfort. He even dared to take off his boots and dip his feet in the stream, letting the gentle current wash away the salt and grime of the sea. Ghost lay in the shallows, muzzle resting on a rock, eyes half closed in contentment. But he didn't allow himself too much peace. Caution still tugged at him. It would not do to stay in one place too long without scouting for threats. He rose, boots in hand, and walked barefoot along the bank for a short distance, scanning the undergrowth for any sign of human presence or large predators. Palms and thick bushes rose on either side. The soil smelled rich, full of decaying plant matter that nurtured new growth. No footprints or paths presented themselves. After a careful survey, he returned to the stream and pulled on his boots again. If he spent the night here, at least he would have fresh water. He found a relatively open space beneath a trio of broad-leafed trees, where the ground was soft but not submerged. With the last of the daylight seeping through the canopy, he gathered fallen branches and dry leaves, building a small fire ring with stones. A spark from flint and steel soon coaxed a modest flame to life. The smell of smoke curled upward, mingling with the earthy scents. Ghost, ever watchful, prowled around the perimeter, marking territory and scaring off small creatures. The fire allowed John to dry some of his soaked garments, and perhaps roast a bit of what he might catch. He'd glimpsed fish in the stream, slender silver shapes darting in the deeper sections. With a makeshift spear carved from a branch, he managed to skewer 2 small fish. They were hardly a feast, but once cleaned, they offered fresh protein that reminded him how long it had been since he had eaten anything truly nourishing. The taste was mild and a bit bland, but a significant improvement over salted meat and dryness. He gave Ghost the second fish, though the direwolf devoured it in a few quick bites, bones and all. As night settled in, the island's sounds changed. A chorus of insects rose, a shrill symphony that pulsed in waves. Occasionally, John heard distant screeches from some unknown bird or beast. The trees rustled with life. It felt more alive than anywhere he had been in the last weeks, vibrant in a way the north never was. He stared into the flames, remembering Winterfell's crisp nights and the hush of pine forests under the snow. Here, everything was lush, tangled, and loud. He felt an odd pang of longing for the north's cold clarity. He gazed up through a gap in the canopy. The stars were brilliant, as if sharpened by the day's fierce light. He found the familiar patterns: the ice dragon, the sword of the morning. The memory of Sam's voice reciting old lore about the starry realms tugged at him. How he missed that gentle soul, the friend who had stood by him through horrors and heartbreak. He wondered if Sam would have recognized how this place teemed with possibility. Perhaps. But Sam was gone to his own fate, and John was here, a drifting man with a half-formed purpose. Eventually, the fire burned low. He let it die, mindful of not creating too much smoke that might attract unwanted attention. Stretching out on the ground, he used his cloak for a blanket, resting his head on a folded scrap of cloth. Ghost lay against him, providing warmth in the humid dark. John closed his eyes, lulled by the cyclical hum of insects. His breathing slowed, the tension in his limbs easing. For the first time in what felt like ages, the nightmares of Valyria did not immediately rise to snatch him away. He sank into sleep as one sinking into deep waters. The night passed without incident. Morning arrived with a pale glow filtering through the palms, accompanied by the chatter of birds. John woke, feeling a dull stiffness in his shoulders but otherwise rested. The memory of the fish's taste lingered, coaxing a desire for more. Before breaking camp, he attempted another catch in the stream, managing to spear a single fish that, while small, provided a bit of breakfast. After that, he refilled his waterskin thoroughly and washed his face. The day promised to be sweltering again, the humidity wrapping around him like a wet cloak. He returned to the beach to check on the skiff. The tide had crept closer, but he had pulled the boat far enough up the sand that it remained secure. The supplies were as he left them, though he realized he was nearly out of dried meat. Now that he had fresh water, he might remain on the island a day or two to gather more food and rest. Yet he felt an urge to keep moving, to find a port where he could replenish properly and learn where he truly was. The idea of wandering from island to island in the summer sea, if this even was the summer sea, did not appeal to him. He spent part of the morning exploring the perimeter of the island, boots sinking into wet sand. The rising sun glinted off the waves, and in the shallows, he saw schools of fish darting away from his shadow. Overhead, gulls and other seabirds circled, occasionally diving to snatch prey from the water. He found no evidence of men, no footprints or fires, no huts or felled trees. Only driftwood, seashells, and the debris of storms. At one point, he discovered a half-rotted barrel washed ashore, staves cracked and ringed with barnacles, likely flotsam from a passing ship. By midday, he returned to his makeshift camp beneath the palms. The day's heat was intense, sweat beading on his brow. He took refuge in the shade, letting the slightest breeze cool his damp skin. Ghost sprawled on his side, panting. Neither of them was used to this tropical climate. John drank more water, thankful that the stream ensured he wouldn't go thirsty. His stomach growled, prompting him to try fishing again, or to see if the island offered any fruit. He rummaged around, checking the trees. Some bore small, hard clusters that might have been nuts, but he could not tell if they were edible. Others dangled bright orange pods that smelled sweet and sour. He tested a bit, hoping it wasn't poisonous, and found it tart but not unpleasant. He ate a few, offering some to Ghost, who sniffed them disdainfully and patted away. By late afternoon, he felt restless. Though the island was safe enough for the moment, he could not remain indefinitely. He remembered how the sea had opened before him when he escaped Valyria's domain. Perhaps if he sailed another day or two, he would reach a shipping lane or a known harbor. Even if it was a pirate's den, he might parley for passage, or at least learn his bearings. With that in mind, he gathered his gear, ensuring everything was stowed securely in the skiff. The battered boat remained afloat and intact, though it showed signs of wear. He'd have to be careful not to test its limits in rough weather. Before he left, he filled every container he had with fresh water, including the empty jars had scavenged from the boat's minimal stores. Then he loaded them into the skiff, checked the small sail for any tears, and prepared to launch once more. Ghost leapt aboard gracefully, as if he too sensed they should be moving on. A pang of regret flickered in John at leaving the island's safety, but lingering served no purpose. By the time he pushed off, the sun was sinking toward the west, painting the sky with colors of molten gold and pink. He used the oars to guide the skiff out past the shallows, then hoisted the sail. A mild breeze blew from the southeast, enough to help him navigate westward. He let the current set him on a course that felt roughly right, though he couldn't be certain. The horizon stretched out, calm and open, inviting but uncertain. Night fell gently, and the sky turned violet. Stars emerged in faint clusters. The air cooled, offering respite from the day's heat. John rowed intermittently, using the sail when the wind permitted, resting his arms when it died. Ghost lay curled at his feet, blinking at the moonlit waves. Hours passed in a soft hush, broken only by the sea's whisper and the boat's rhythmic creak. He welcomed the quiet, lulled by the knowledge that he had escaped the horrors behind him. Still, the memory of Valyria pressed like a bruise against his mind. He found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, half expecting to see black spires in the distance or the glow of volcanic eruptions. But the horizon remained empty, the darkness unbroken save for starlight. At some point in the depths of night, he dozed, arms draped over the sides of the skiff. When he startled awake, the moon hung low, silver light rippling across the water. He realized the wind had shifted, pushing him farther west. A scattering of clouds drifted overhead, veiling the moon for moments at a time. He rubbed sleep from his eyes, forcing himself to remain alert. The sea's darkness was both solace and threat. Any hidden rocks or sudden squalls could spell disaster for such a small craft. Morning found him at sea again, the sun rising behind his left shoulder. No land was in sight, only a faint haze on the horizon that might be anything. His hunger gnawed. He ate sparingly of the fruit he had gathered, washing it down with fresh water. It was a flimsy meal, but it would sustain him. Hours wore on. The sun climbed higher, scorching his neck. He rigged the sail to offer what shade he could, though it was minimal. Around midday, as he scoured the horizon, he saw a speck that glided across the water, a faint silhouette of a ship. The heartbeat in his chest quickened. He scrambled to adjust the sail, angling the skiff to intercept. The vessel was distant, little more than a dark blot on the shimmering blue, but it was the first sign of other travelers he'd seen since leaving Eastwatch's smuggler. With a desperate energy he rowed, though he was uncertain if he was closing the distance. The ship's sails were multiple, large and billowing, likely a merchant galley or a caravel. He squinted, trying to discern any flags or insignia. From this range, it was impossible to tell. Ghost sensed his excitement and stood, peering at the distant shape. John rowed until his arms burned, the boat cutting a shallow wake in the calm sea. He prayed the wind would not shift against him. Gradually, the silhouette grew more defined. He could make out 2 masts, a high forecastle, and a hull that sparkled in the sunlight. The vessel was on a course that intersected his own, but he worried it might pass too far away for him to signal. With no horns or flares, he had only his voice or perhaps a scrap of cloth to wave. When he judged he was as close as he could manage, he stood in the boat, risking a wobble that nearly sent him overboard, and shouted at the top of his lungs. The wind snatched his words, but he kept shouting, hoping a lookout might catch a glimpse. He waved his arms, waved the length of cloth he used for the sail's tie. Anything to draw attention. The ship loomed larger now, definitely more than a simple fishing craft. A Bravosea trader, or Pentoshi, or maybe even Lyseni. His heart thundered, both hopeful and anxious. If they were pirates, he might have jumped from the frying pan into the fire. He waited, breathless. The ship continued forward, sails full, not slowing. A flicker of despair threatened to seize him. Then he saw movement on the deck, small figures dashing about. The prow angled slightly toward him. Relief flooded him. Someone had seen him. He rowed closer, motioning overhead, even calling out. The ship adjusted course, and soon he could make out voices yelling in a language he couldn't identify from this distance. The hull bore a painted emblem near the bow, a golden hippocampus on a field of teal. It was not a sigil he recognized from Westeros, which meant it likely belonged to one of the free cities or a lesser trade house. A wave of caution tempered his relief. He must approach carefully, hands visible, no threat. He was alone, but men could be unpredictable. He guided the skiff alongside the larger vessel as the crew threw ropes down. 2 sailors hoisted him up, while a third man jabbed a short spear in his direction, a silent warning not to try anything foolish. Jon kept his palms open, speaking calmly. "I'm unarmed," he said, though Longclaw and the dagger remained strapped to his body. "I mean you no harm. I need passage or any aid you can spare." Once on deck, he saw a mix of faces, dark-haired, olive-skinned men wearing sashes and open vests, a few with bandanas tied around their foreheads. Their speech was quick and musical. He recognized a handful of Valyrian words, but not enough to form sentences. They eyed him with suspicion, taking in the black leathers and the sword hilt at his side. Ghost leapt onto the deck with a growl, prompting startled cries from the crew. One brandished a pole as if to ward off a wild beast. Jon quickly moved between them and the dire wolf. "He's my companion. He won't harm you unless you try to harm him." He prayed that was true. A tall, bearded man approached, his bearing that of an officer or captain. He barked commands in that fluid language, and the men reluctantly stood down. The captain studied Jon with sharp eyes, then spoke in heavily accented common tongue. "You are far from your home, I think." Jon inclined his head. "I am. My name is Jon Snow. Thank you for picking me up." He gestured to the small skiff bobbing below, trailing by a rope. "I had nowhere else to turn." The captain nodded, arms folded over his chest. "I am Raymaro of Gain, master of this vessel. We trade between Valyria and the Basilisk Isles. You are alone." Jon glanced around, noticing some men offloading cargo or retying sails. Others had gathered to gawk. "I lost my ship," he replied simply. "I've been traveling a long time." He wasn't eager to admit he'd come from Valyria's outskirts, fearing how they might react. "I can pay you for passage if needed. I have a few coins." Raymaro's brow rose. "That might be arranged. Where do you wish to go?" Jon hesitated. He truly didn't have a specific port in mind, only a vague plan to find a safer harbor. Somewhere with a market and a dock to repair a boat or buy passage north. Anywhere safe. At that, the captain barked a laugh. Safe is a word seldom heard in these seas. "We are bound for Valyria to trade spices and pearls. From there, we may go on to Volantis or Korth, depending on the profit." He shrugged. "We will not feed you for nothing, or carry you for free. Coin or labor? Which do you have?" Jon considered. He had little coin left after paying the Braavosi smuggler. "I can work," he said. "I know something of rigging sails, though not as well as your men, and I can fight if needed." Raymaro's gaze flicked to Ghost. "Your beast. He can help you fight, I suppose." Another short laugh. "Very well, we'll see if you're worth the trouble. In the meantime, you'll sleep on deck until we reach Valyria. After that, we part ways, or you pay more. Agreed?" Jon nodded. "Agreed. And my thanks, Captain." Now, the tension on deck lessened somewhat, though Jon noticed the sailors still shot wary glances at Ghost. He helped them hoist his skiff aboard, stowing it near the stern so it wouldn't drag behind. Then he busied himself with whatever tasks Raymaro assigned. Tying lines, scrubbing the deck, hauling crates. The men spoke mostly in their own tongue, but a few used bits of broken common to direct him. He worked without complaint, letting the labor distract him from the swirl of thoughts in his head. That evening, as the sun set over a calm sea, the cook ladled out a thin stew of fish and spices. Jon ate his portion gratefully, sharing bits with Ghost. The crew kept a respectful distance, observing him as one might observe a stray dog that might yet bite, but at least no one threatened him or tried to confiscate his weapons. When the captain came by to check on him, John made sure to appear diligent in his tasks, coiling ropes with practiced efficiency. Raymaro merely grunted and moved on, apparently satisfied. Days passed in this manner. The ship, named the Sojourner's Fortune, plowed through the waves at a steady pace, each day bringing new breezes and changing skies. John fell into the rhythms of the crew, standing watch at odd hours, manning the rigging when storms threatened, and hauling cargo from hold to deck when Raymaro ordered inspections. Ghost adapted, prowling the deck and curling up near John's sleeping corner each night. Whenever a sailor ventured too close, the direwolf pinned him with a scarlet stare. In time they grew accustomed to one another, though it remained an uneasy peace. John gleaned bits of their language, learning the words for starboard, rope, wind, cargo. He learned enough to get by. And sometimes the men teased him, repeating phrases until he spoke them awkwardly. He sensed no true malice in their jests, only curiosity. They came from lands far different than his own. Some from the islands near Neath, others from the northern coasts near Norvos. A few wore tattoos of stylized sea creatures, or carried amulets meant to ward off evil spirits. When storms struck, he remembered the old lessons from the Bravosi smuggler. He helped lower the sails, secure the cargo, and bail water from the hold. The sea turned violent at times, tossing the Fortune about until it threatened to capsize. John gritted his teeth and fought against the roar of wind and the lash of rain. More than once, he feared he might be flung into the waves. Yet the captain was skilled, and the Fortune weathered each squall. Whenever the storm abated, the crew emerged to repair tears in the sails and cracks in the deck, cursing the sea, but also singing songs of gratitude for survival. John joined them in labors if not in songs, for he did not know the words. At night, he sometimes found a quiet corner to reflect. He would unwrap the Valyrian dagger or the scroll case, turning them over in his hands. If any of the crew noticed, they never asked. Ghost watched him silently, as though sensing these items were a tether to another life. In stolen moments, John tried to parse a glyph or two by the light of the ship's lanterns, but with limited success. He needed guidance to decode them properly, or at least more time than the hectic chores allowed. Still, the presence of these relics reminded him that his journey was not aimless. He carried part of Valyria's secret. Whether it was a boon or a curse remained uncertain. Occasionally, John overheard the captain discussing their route with his mates. He picked up enough words to know that Valyria lay some days further south. Once, it had been a colony of the Valyrian freehold, left to ruin after the Doom. But in more recent decades, traders had settled parts of it, using the workable harbors. Rumor claimed that the interior was still haunted by old curses. John wondered if he was leaping from one ruin to another. But if Valyria had fresh markets and new goods, it might also have a port from which he could sail north, or at least find a route to a more familiar place. On the 5th morning since he boarded, the Fortune's lookout cried out from the crow's nest, pointing to a faint outline on the horizon. By midday, John saw it too, the dark strip of land rising from the sea, crowned with emerald hills. As they drew nearer, the wind carried a hint of spices and wildflowers. The coastline was jagged, dotted with rocky promontories. A cluster of wooden piers jutted from a sheltered cove, and beyond that stood a scattering of low buildings roofed with red tiles. This was Valyria's makeshift port, Raymaro explained. A ramshackle settlement that served as a hub for spices, dyes, and rare jungle products. Trade ships from Slaver's Bay, the Summer Islands, and even as far as Korth would sometimes dock here. But the presence of pirates and local warlords meant the place was never truly stable. The captain intended to unload cargo quickly, secure whatever deals he could, and sail on. As they neared the harbor, the coastline revealed patches of lush vegetation, thick vines hanging from trees that flourished in the humid climate. The settlement itself was smaller than John expected, perhaps a cluster of a few dozen buildings hugging the curved shore. 3 other ships were anchored in the deeper water, 2 of them battered cogs that might be local, and another, sleeker craft bearing a foreign banner. The Fortune slipped into the harbor, sails billowing in the steady breeze. Docks creaked underfoot as the crew secured mooring lines, tying the vessel to stout wooden pilings. Voices echoed across the pier, stevedores shouting in a mix of tongues, laborers hauling crates, hawkers selling fruit. An overlay of pungent scents hung in the air. Fish, spices, salt, and sweat all mingled in the thick warmth. After days at sea, the bustle assaulted John's senses. But it was undeniably a sign of civilization. Ghost trotted close to him, ears perked, nose twitching at the unfamiliar smells. The crewmen immediately busied themselves offloading cargo. John helped for a time, hoisting crates of pungent spices. He recognized pepper, cinnamon, and other scents he couldn't name but found overwhelming. Raymaro barked orders, overseeing negotiations with a local factor who wore a bright yellow robe and gold hoops in his ears. They conferred in rapid bursts of the local language. Coin clinked, crates changed hands, scribes took notes. When the main cargo was unloaded, Raymaro approached John. "We stay here 2 days at most," he said in common. "After that, we sail for Korth. If you want to come, you'll keep working. If you'd rather find your own way, do it now." John looked around at the bustling pier, the thick tropical forest just beyond the settlement. Korth lay far to the southeast, across the vast seas. He had little desire to push even farther from Westeros, but nor did he want to remain in this half-ruined colony of Valyria. If a ship bound for Volantis or Braavos was here, perhaps he could negotiate passage. He thanked the captain. "You've done me a great service letting me sail with you. I think I'll seek out other prospects now." Raymaro shrugged, neither pleased nor displeased. "As you wish. Take care. There are dangerous men here. More dangerous than the sea, sometimes." With that, he strode off, shouting at a pair of sailors struggling with a large crate. John fetched his few belongings from his corner of the deck, a small bundle of clothes, his precious relics, and the meager coin he had left. Ghost followed as he stepped onto the dock. The heat rolled over them like a solid wall. Sweat beaded on John's brow almost instantly. He stood there a moment, adjusting to the swirl of voices and smells. The settlement stretched inland in a winding row of clay-walled houses and wooden shacks. Narrow lanes paved in rough cobblestone led past market stalls where exotic birds squawked in wicker cages, and vendors displayed bright swathes of cloth. The crowd was diverse: brown-skinned locals, lean men with shaved heads, bearded travelers from the east, a few pale Lyseni with dyed blue hair. John felt a moment of disorientation. This was a far cry from the austere courtyard of Castle Black. He headed up the main lane, Ghost at his side. Most people gave the direwolf a wide berth, though one or two curious children gawked from behind their mothers' skirts. John caught snippets of conversation in multiple tongues. He scanned for any sign or banner that might indicate a ship traveling to the western ports. His best chance lay with the harbor taverns or the trading outposts. Someone, somewhere, might be looking for swords to guard a caravan or deckhands to crew a vessel bound north. As he wandered, he came upon a ramshackle building with a painted sign of a kraken or some sort of sea creature. The smell of ale and cooking oil wafted from within. A tavern, if ever there was one. Perhaps he could make inquiries there. He ducked under the low lintel, stepping into a dim interior lit by hanging lanterns. Tables filled the space, each occupied by noisy sailors or merchants. A bar lined one wall, tended by a bald man with a scar across his chin. He paused when he saw Ghost, but waved John in with only a mild look of warning. John took a seat near the bar, grateful for the slight shade. Ghost settled at his feet, muzzle resting on his paws. He ordered a mug of the local ale, warm sour, but refreshing enough. The barkeep spoke a passable version of common. Between swigs, John asked if there were any ships bound for Volantis or Westeros. The barkeep shrugged, said that a few captains came through every month. One might be heading west next week, or next month, or never. Hard to say. Most were just as likely to take shipments along the Summersea's coastline, or risk a run to the Jade Gates. John suppressed a sigh. He had hoped for a more direct route. Perhaps his best chance was to wait and watch for new arrivals. The barkeep offered some fried plantains and fish for a small coin, and John accepted. The meal was greasy but filling. He let Ghost gnaw on a leftover fishtail. Nearby patrons eyed the direwolf warily, but no one raised a fuss. A few men tried to strike conversation, speaking in broken common, inquiring about Joan's homeland or his unusual companion. He offered sparse answers, not wishing to reveal too much about himself. Hours passed in this cramped tavern. John's mind drifted. Each time the door opened, letting in a blast of sunlight, he glanced to see if a new face might bring opportunity or threat. He pondered whether he should simply return to the Fortune and sail to Korth, but that felt like stepping yet further from any meaningful path. Korth was a city of wonders and illusions, where ambition devoured lesser men. He doubted he would find peace or direction there. Only more entanglements. The tension of indecision pulled at him. Part of him wondered if he should even return to Westeros. What waited for him there? He pictured Winterfell under the rule of his siblings, though the realm had changed drastically. The idea of returning as a solitary wanderer, with no banner, no claim, seemed hollow. But another voice in him insisted that the North was where he belonged. He was a Stark, or had believed so for most of his life. Even if Targaryen blood coursed in his veins, the memory of Ned Stark was what had shaped him. Perhaps that was reason enough to go back, to see if any place still existed for him in that world. Eventually he rose from the table, dropping a few coins for the meal. Ghost padded behind him, tail low. Outside, the day was sliding into twilight, the sky tinted with apricot hues. A languid hush had fallen over the settlement, though pockets of noise still flared near the piers. Jon made his way toward the waterfront, searching for a place to sleep. The few inns he spotted were cramped and overpriced, their owners eyeing him and Ghost with skepticism. Finally, he found a stable-like hostel that agreed to let him sleep on a pallet in the corner if he kept the direwolf from disturbing the animals. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was cheap, and he valued coin more than comfort right now. He settled onto the straw pallet as dusk sank into night, the sounds of horse-like creatures shifting in their stalls. Ghost chose a spot near the door, ever vigilant. Jon's eyes drifted closed, lulled by fatigue and the day's sweltering heat. Dreams came in flickers. He saw the black spires of Valyria once more, the swirling ash, the robed phantom that vanished at the edges of sight. The memory of that ghostly figure unsettled him, reminding him that the city's curse might still cling to him. In the dream, the figure's eyes snapped open, glowing pale green in the gloom. He reached out, and Jon felt a chilling wave of dread. He jerked awake, breath heaving. The stable was dark, lit by a single lantern near the entrance. Ghost remained watchful, but no threat stirred. Jon rubbed his temples, wrestling down the panic that lingered. He told himself it was just a nightmare, but a deeper intuition warned him that something in the scroll or the dagger had awakened a shadow of the past. Perhaps it was only guilt or fear. Whatever the cause, it meant he might never be entirely free. Morning arrived with the stable boy prodding him to move aside while he fed the animals. Jon stretched out the stiffness in his back. The day's heat already pressed at the air. He thanked the boy and left, strolling into the settlement street. Merchants were beginning to open their stalls, displaying spices, furs, carved trinkets of exotic wood. He paused at a booth selling fruit, and bartered a few coins for bananas and a handful of red berries. As he ate, he surveyed the harbor. More ships had arrived overnight, and at least one, a two-masted caravel with flamboyant flags, looked like it might be heading west. He approached the pier, where a wiry man with sun-bleached hair was overseeing the unloading of dyed fabrics. Jon caught his eye and asked if the ship sailed for Volantis. The man studied him, then shook his head. "We go to the Isle of Elephas, maybe to the Basilisk Isles. After that, who knows?" Jon thanked him and moved on, asking each new face he encountered. The answers were the same. No one seemed to be heading exactly where he wanted. Some eyed him for potential work as a guard, but their journeys led south or east. He began to wonder if he might be stuck here indefinitely, forced to sign on to a random crew to keep moving at all. Late in the afternoon, as the sun beat down relentlessly, he found a shady corner near a warehouse and slumped against the wall. A sick feeling gnawed at him. He had fled the north, braved Valyria, only to become a stranded wanderer. Part of him questioned why he was so intent on returning to any known land. He could vanish here, live anonymously among these foreign traders, maybe even carve out a role as a mercenary. Yet that thought tasted bitter. He might hide from the ghosts that hounded him, but he would never outrun his own heart. He closed his eyes, letting the drone of the docks lull his racing mind. Ghost lay at his side, panting in the heat. Voices drifted past, men haggling, crates banging, gulls screeching overhead. Then he heard a distinct snippet of conversation, in a dialect of High Valyrian, spoken close by. A woman's voice, low and confident, addressing someone about a shipping manifest. John opened his eyes, scanning the area. Two figures stood near a stack of crates. A tall woman with braided silver blonde hair, wearing a loose tunic and breeches, and a shorter man with a ledger in hand. The woman's accent was refined, her posture poised. Her hair color, reminiscent of Valyrian lineage, snagged his attention. Though many in Essos claimed partial heritage, he watched her finish her conversation, then stride away with the easy grace of someone who'd been on ships her entire life. She walked toward a moored caravel that bore a sigil of a dragon's silhouette entwined with a lotus. Could she be from Lys? Or another free city that still prized Valyrian blood? Something in John stirred, an instinct he couldn't name. He rose, trailing her at a respectful distance. Ghost followed, though the direwolf's presence drew curious stares. The woman spoke to a few sailors on the caravel's gangplank. As John approached, she glanced his way, eyes narrowing slightly. Her irises were pale gray, a shade that might pass for silver under certain light. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said in High Valyrian, "You're staring. Is there something you need?" Her words were crisp, the timbre of authority not entirely concealed by her neutral tone. John cleared his throat. In the same language, albeit awkwardly, he replied, "Forgive me. I overheard you speaking Valyrian. I'm looking for passage west. Volantis, if possible." He paused, uncertain whether he should offer a deeper explanation. She studied him, gaze lingering on his sword, then on Ghost. "Volantis is not my primary destination, but I will be putting in there eventually. It depends on how profitable my next stops are." He offered a small bow of respect. "I can pay or work for my passage." He switched to the common tongue, hoping to avoid any missteps in formal Valyrian. "I have some coin, though not much. I can handle a sword, and I know my way around a ship enough to be useful." She responded in fluent common. "I see. And why should I take you rather than the next sellsword or deckhand who stumbles along?" John considered. Her directness reminded him a bit of Daenerys, though he quickly banished the comparison. "I'm not just a sellsword," he said quietly. "I have experience in command, in negotiation, in unusual circumstances. I can be of service if trouble arises." Her eyebrow arched, a hint of wry amusement. "You speak like a knight of Westeros, but you don't look like one. I won't pry into your story. If you can pay something, and if you'll fight if needed, I may have space. My name is Elia Sararian." She extended a hand. "This is my ship, the Red Orchid." Joan's breath caught momentarily at the name Sararian. The similarity to Targaryen was striking, though he'd never heard of such a house. "John," he managed. He clasped her hand in a firm grip. "Jon Snow." She gave his hand a single shake, then released it. "If you wish to book passage, speak with my quartermaster. We sail in 3 days for a route through the summer sea, stopping at certain islands where I have trade contacts. After that, we may turn north for Volantis." She glanced at Ghost, who watched her with his unwavering red stare. "I trust your beast can behave around my crew." John nodded. "He will, as long as no one tries to harm him." A faint smile touched her lips. "A fair condition." Then she flicked her gaze to a burly man, leaning on a rail. "That's Elix. He'll handle your details. Bring your coin and whatever you want to stow. If we agree on terms, you'll be aboard." Gratitude swelled in him, though he remained cautious. This was still Essos, a land of shifting loyalties. "Thank you," he said. She tipped her chin in acknowledgement, then stepped onto the ship's deck, continuing her inspection of cargo. John exhaled. His heart hammered. This might be the opening he needed. He approached Elix, who, despite a stoic demeanor, seemed willing to discuss the matter. They haggled over rates. Alex wanted more coin than John could readily offer, so they settled on a hybrid arrangement. A modest payment plus a pledge of arms should the ship be threatened. John agreed, counting out what silver and copper he had left. The rest he would make up in service. They shook hands on it. In 3 days, the Red Orchid would sail, carrying him away from this half-ruined colony on the edge of the old Valyrian coast, toward Volantis, and perhaps, in time, toward Westeros. He could feel the same tension winding through him again. Excitement, dread, uncertainty. But at least now he had a heading, a direction in which to move. That night, he lay in the stable once more, turning the Valyrian dagger over in his hands. The faint lamplight shimmered along its edge, the pattern etched into the steel like faint waves. He wondered if House Serarian truly traced some lineage to old Valyria, or if it was simply a name she had chosen for prestige. The braided silver hair of Elia Serarian echoed Targaryen features, but the free cities were full of lines that claimed some drop of dragon's blood. More importantly, did it matter to him? He thought of the scroll case again, the swirling circles on the parchment. If and when they reached Volantis, might he find a scholar bold enough to interpret them? Or would he place them in the Citadel's hands? The answers to such questions remained murky, overshadowed by his immediate goal of securing safe passage. Still, that subtle thrill of curiosity lingered, a sense of carrying a piece of lost power that might shape the future in ways he couldn't imagine. Ghost stirred, sniffing at the stable door. Outside, the night was alive with foreign insects and the occasional drunken shout from the taverns. John closed his eyes, letting the wave of weariness pass over him. In a few days, his path would continue. He recalled the black labyrinth of Valyria, the arcane hush of its ruins. Now he was back among living souls, forging bargains and seeking roots like any other wanderer. Part of him longed for the quiet finality of the north snows, the cleansing cold that left no doubt about one's place in the world. But that old life was gone. He was adrift in the wide seas, bearing a name that no longer fit quite right. The only certainty was the breath in his lungs, the feel of Ghost's warm fur under his hand, and the faint glimmer of steel that had survived the doom itself. Tomorrow, he would gather what he had, step aboard the Red Orchid, and sail onward, ever onward, chasing fragments of meaning and perhaps, in time, forging a new destiny from the ashes of the old.